The alarm bell rang across Blackthorn territory before dawn, and Draven Cross was already moving before his eyes fully opened. 20 years of training had taught his body to react to danger faster than his mind could process it, and tonight was no different. He grabbed his coat, stepped into the cold morning air, and felt his heart pound in a way it had not pounded in 2 decades. Something was wrong. Something was close. He stood at the edge of the training field, watching his warriors gather in the mist, their breath rising like smoke. His beta, Callum Hart, ran toward him with a look Draven had learned to dread over the years, the look that meant trouble had crossed their border again. "Strangers at the north gate," Callum said, catching his breath. "A woman and a girl. No pack scent on either of them. The guards want your word before they let them through." Draven's jaw tightened. Strangers rarely came to Blackthorn without a reason, and reasons were rarely good. His pack had survived too many betrayals to trust easily, and he had built high walls, both physical and personal, to keep his people safe. He nodded once and began walking toward the gate, his long strides eating up the frozen ground. The north gate stood at the farthest edge of the territory, where thick pine trees gave way to open fields. 2 guards stood with weapons lowered but ready, watching a woman who stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the shoulder of a girl who looked no older than 19. The woman's eyes did not waver when Draven approached. She held herself the way someone holds themselves when they have learned, through hard experience, never to show fear. "Name," Draven said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man, used to being obeyed instantly. "Ren," the woman answered. "This is my daughter Ivy. We are not here to cause trouble. We only need shelter for a short while." Draven studied her closely. Something about her felt familiar, though he could not place why. Her clothes were worn from travel, her shoes caked with mud, and there was an exhaustion in her eyes that spoke of many nights without rest. But it was the girl beside her, who held his attention longer than he intended. She kept her gaze low, her fingers twisting nervously into the sleeve of her jacket. Yet there was something in the shape of her face, something in the way she stood, that struck him like a blow to the chest, though he could not say why. "You have no pack," he said. It was not a question. "We left ours a long time ago," Ren answered carefully. "It was not safe there." Draven's warriors exchanged glances. Packless wolves were rare, and those who traveled without protection usually carried stories darker than they were willing to share. Still, something in him, some instinct buried deep beneath years of guarded discipline, told him to let them in, rather than turn them away. He had spent 20 years turning away strangers who might have been threats. Tonight, for reasons he could not explain even to himself, he did not want to turn these 2 away. "They can stay in the guest quarters near the healer's house," Draven said finally. "Watched, but not restrained. If they cause harm, they answer to me." Callum raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He knew better than to question his alpha in front of others, though the surprise on his face was clear. Draven Cross never allowed unknown wolves this close to the heart of the pack. Not since the night that changed everything, 20 years ago, the night his mate disappeared into fire and chaos, and was never seen again. As Ren and Ivy were led through the gates, Draven remained behind, staring at the trees where the mist still clung low to the ground. He told himself his decision was based on caution, on the desire to understand a possible threat rather than let it wander unwatched. But deep down, a small and unfamiliar hope had stirred inside him, a hope he had buried so long ago that he barely recognized the feeling anymore. The pack of Blackthorn was known across the region for its strength and discipline, but more than that, it was known for the tragedy of its alpha king. 20 years earlier, a devastating attack had torn through their territory, in the middle of the night, an attack led by a rival pack seeking to weaken Blackthorn's hold on the northern lands. Buildings had burned, warriors had fallen, and in the chaos, Draven's mate, Elena, had vanished without a trace. For weeks after, search parties had combed every forest, every river, every abandoned den for miles. They found nothing, no body, no sign of struggle beyond the wreckage of that single terrible night. Some believed she had died in the fire, her remains lost to the flames. Others whispered that she had been taken, though no ransom or demand ever came. As the years passed, hope faded into memory, and memory faded into legend. The pack moved forward. Draven did not. He built himself into a king made of iron, someone who ruled with unshakable control, because control was the only thing that kept the grief from swallowing him whole. He had never taken another mate. He had never allowed himself to imagine a future beyond duty. His council pressured him constantly to secure an heir, to marry for the good of the pack rather than the desires of the heart, but he refused every proposal, every arranged meeting, every whispered suggestion that Elena was gone and it was time to move on. Now, 20 years later, two strangers had arrived at his gate, and something about the girl's eyes had cracked the wall he had spent 2 decades building. That evening, Draven found himself walking toward the guest quarters instead of retreating to his study as he usually did after sunset. He told himself he simply wanted to assess the newcomers more closely, to determine if they posed any danger to his people. He told himself many things as he walked, none of which fully explained the strange pull guiding his steps. He found Ren sitting outside the small guest house, watching the stars with a wariness that never seemed to leave her. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Your daughter," Draven said finally. "Where is she?" "Sleeping," Ren answered. "She does not trust new places easily. It has been hard for her, moving so often." "Why do you move so often?" Draven asked, keeping his tone even, though his curiosity had sharpened into something closer to demand. Ren's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into careful neutrality. "Because it has never been safe to stay in one place for long," she said. "Not for us." Draven wanted to press further, but something in her eyes told him she would give him nothing more tonight. He nodded once and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Your pack," she said quietly. "They speak of you as though you carry a great sadness. Is that true?" He turned back to face her, surprised by the directness of the question. Few people dared to speak so plainly to him. "That is not something I discuss with strangers," he said, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "I understand," Ren said. "I only ask because sadness recognizes sadness, even across strangers." Draven said nothing, but her words lingered with him long after he walked away. He returned to his study that night, but instead of reviewing pack reports as he usually did, he found himself staring at an old photograph he kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. Elena's smile looked back at him, frozen in time, unchanged, while everything around her had aged 20 years. He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, the way he had done countless nights before, and wondered, not for the first time, what she would think of the man he had become. The next morning, the pack gathered for the daily assembly, a routine where warriors reported patrol updates and elders discussed pack matters. Draven stood at the front, listening with only half his attention, his mind drifting again and again to the girl he had barely spoken to yet could not stop thinking about. It was Callum who noticed first, standing beside him with narrowed eyes, as Ivy crossed the training field with Ren, heading toward the healer's house for a routine check required of all newcomers. "You've been distracted since last night," Callum said quietly, once the assembly ended. "I am simply being cautious," Draven replied, though even to his own ears, the excuse sounded thin. Callum studied him for a long moment before speaking again, his voice lower now, careful. "The girl," he said. "There is something about her that unsettles me too. I cannot explain it, but it feels like looking at a ghost." Draven's chest tightened at the word. He had thought the same thing the night before, though he had refused to allow himself to fully acknowledge it. A ghost, a memory given shape and breath and life, walking through his territory, as though summoned from the deepest corners of his grief. "She is a stranger," Draven said firmly, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Nothing more. But that afternoon, as he watched Ivy sit quietly beneath the old oak tree near the healer's house, sketching something in a worn notebook, he found himself walking toward her before he consciously decided to do so. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, startled but not afraid, and for the first time, he saw her eyes clearly in the daylight. They were the exact shade of soft brown that Elena's had been, warm and deep, the kind of eyes that seemed to hold quiet strength beneath a gentle surface. Draven's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he could not speak at all. "Is something wrong?" Ivy asked, tilting her head slightly, unaware of the storm her simple question had stirred inside him. "No," Draven managed finally. "I only wanted to see that you were settling in comfortably." "It's peaceful here," Ivy said, glancing around at the tall trees and quiet fields. We haven't stayed anywhere peaceful in a long time. Why is that? Draven asked, unable to stop himself. Ivy hesitated, glancing toward the healer's house where her mother had gone, as though checking that she was truly out of earshot. My mother says it isn't safe for us to stay too long in one pack, she said softly. She never explains why. She just says we have to keep moving, keep hidden. I used to ask more questions when I was younger, but she always looked so sad when I did, so I stopped asking. Draven felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of concern and a strange, aching familiarity he could not yet name. You've never asked her about your father? He said before he could stop himself. Ivy's expression clouded slightly. I used to, she admitted. She always said he was somewhere far away, and that maybe someday I would understand. I stopped asking that too. The words hit Draven harder than he expected, striking at wounds he had spent 20 years trying to seal shut. He wanted to ask more, wanted to demand answers immediately, but something in Ivy's guarded posture told him this was not the moment. She was a girl who had learned caution the way most people learn to breathe, without thinking, simply because survival demanded it. Thank you for speaking with me, Draven said instead, forcing his voice to remain calm. I hope you continue to feel safe here. As he walked away, his mind raced with questions he could not yet voice aloud, not even to Callum. Coincidences happened, he told himself. Resemblances existed without explanation, but even as he repeated these reassurances in his mind, a deeper, quieter part of him refused to believe them. That night, unable to sleep, Draven walked the perimeter of the Packlands alone, something he rarely did anymore. The moon hung low and full above the trees, casting silver light across the fields where, 20 years ago, fire had once consumed everything he loved. He stopped at the edge of the old battlefield, now overgrown with grass and wildflowers, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to remember. He remembered Elena's laughter echoing through these same fields. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, the way she used to tease him about being too serious, too guarded, too afraid to let joy exist alongside duty. He remembered the night the attack came, the chaos, the smoke, the desperate search through the flames that yielded nothing but ash and silence. He had never allowed himself to fully grieve, not properly, not completely. Grieving would have meant accepting that she was truly gone, and some stubborn, unyielding part of him had never been able to accept that. Now, 20 years later, a girl with Elena's eyes had walked into his territory, accompanied by a woman who refused to explain her past, and who flinched whenever questions grew too close to the truth. Draven stood beneath the moonlight for a long time, his mind a storm of hope and fear intertwined so tightly he could not separate them. He did not yet know the full truth, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. Somewhere behind him, unseen in the shadows of the trees, Ren watched him standing alone in the moonlight, her heart heavy with a secret she had carried for 2 decades. She pressed a hand against her chest, steadying her breathing, and whispered a promise into the night air, a promise made long ago to a woman who had trusted her with everything that mattered most. The truth was coming. She could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, unstoppable and inevitable. And soon, everything she had worked so hard to protect would be tested in ways she had never prepared for. Morning came quickly, and with it, a routine that Draven usually welcomed for its predictability. Today, however, every task felt like a distraction from the questions circling endlessly in his mind. He met with his council in the Great Hall, a wide stone room lined with old banners bearing the Blackthorn crest, a silver wolf against a field of deep green. The elders spoke of harvest reports, border patrols, and trade agreements with neighboring packs, but Draven found himself only half listening, his gaze drifting again and again toward the window that overlooked the training field. An elder named Grace, a woman who had served the pack council since before Draven's father ruled, finally set down her papers and studied him with the sharp attention of someone who missed very little. You seem elsewhere today, Alpha, she said, not unkindly. Is something troubling you? Draven straightened in his seat, forcing his focus back to the room. Nothing that concerns the council, he said. I am simply tired. Grace did not look convinced, but she let the matter drop, though her eyes lingered on him, a moment longer than necessary. The meeting continued, and Draven forced himself through the remaining reports with practiced discipline, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the girl beneath the oak tree and the woman who watched him from the shadows with careful, guarded eyes. When the council meeting ended, Draven excused himself earlier than usual, ignoring Callum's questioning glance as he left the hall. He walked toward the healer's house, telling himself he only wished to confirm that the newcomers had passed their health assessment without concern, though he knew the excuse was thin, even as he formed it in his mind. He found the healer, an older man named Owen, standing outside his small clinic, reviewing notes on a wooden clipboard. "Alpha," Owen said, straightening with mild surprise. "Is there something you need?" "The newcomers," Draven said. "Ren and Ivy." "How did their assessment go?" Owen glanced down at his notes, his expression thoughtful. "Both are healthy," he said, "though the girl shows signs of long-term stress, the kind that comes from years of instability, rather than any illness. Nothing dangerous, simply the marks of a difficult life." Draven nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "And the mother?" "Guarded," Owen said simply. "She answered only the questions required, and nothing more. She watched her daughter throughout the entire assessment, as though expecting danger to appear from nowhere." He paused, studying Draven with the same careful attention Grace had shown earlier. "You seem unusually invested in two strangers, Alpha, if you don't mind me saying so." "I am simply being thorough," Draven replied, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. Owen said nothing further, though the look in his eyes suggested he understood more than he let on. Draven thanked him and continued walking, his path leading him, almost against his own will, toward the guest quarters once again. He found Ivy sitting on the small porch outside the guest house, her notebook open on her lap, though she was not drawing this time. Instead, she stared out at the distant tree line with an expression of quiet longing that struck Draven as far too old for someone her age. "You seem thoughtful," Draven said, announcing his presence before he stepped closer. Ivy looked up, offering a small, polite smile. "I was thinking about how strange it feels to stay somewhere long enough to actually see the sunrise and sunset in the same place," she said. "We usually leave before that happens." "How long do you usually stay in one location?" Draven asked, lowering himself onto the porch steps a respectful distance away from her. "A few weeks, sometimes less," Ivy said. "My mother always has a reason to leave before we get too comfortable. She says, comfort makes people careless, and carelessness makes people vulnerable." "That sounds like someone who has been hurt badly enough to fear it happening again," Draven said quietly, more to himself than to her. Ivy studied him with unexpected perceptiveness. "You sound like someone who understands that feeling," she said. Draven did not answer immediately. The observation struck closer to truth than he wanted to admit to a girl he had known for less than 2 days. "I have experienced loss," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "It changes the way a person moves through the world." "What did you lose?" Ivy asked, her voice gentle, rather than intrusive. "Someone very important to me," Draven said. "Many years ago." Ivy nodded slowly, as though the answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "My mother lost someone important too," she said. "She has never told me who, but sometimes, late at night, I hear her crying when she thinks I'm asleep. She always says the same name, very quietly, like she's afraid saying it too loudly might break something." Draven's entire body went still. "What name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ivy hesitated, glancing toward the guest house, as though worried her mother might overhear. "I've never been sure," she admitted. "It always sounds soft, like it starts with a D, but I could never make out the whole word clearly." The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath Draven's feet. He forced himself to remain calm, to keep his expression neutral, despite the storm raging inside him. "A name starting with a D," whispered in grief during the quiet hours of night. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. Before he could ask another question, the guest house door opened, and Ren stepped outside, her eyes immediately finding her daughter and then, a moment later, Draven seated beside her. Her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, though she quickly masked it with a polite, careful smile. "Alpha," she said, inclining her head slightly. "I hope Ivy hasn't been any trouble." "Not at all," Draven said, rising to his feet. "She has been good company." Ren's eyes moved between them, something unreadable flickering across her face, before settling into practiced neutrality. "We should not take up too much of your time," she said. "You have a pack to lead." Draven understood the dismissal for what it was, though he did not push against it. "Of course," he said. "I will leave you to your afternoon." As he walked away, he could feel Ren's eyes on his back, watchful and guarded, and he understood, with growing certainty, that she knew something she was determined never to share. But questions had been planted in his mind now, questions that would not rest quietly, questions that demanded answers he intended to find, no matter how long it took, or how carefully guarded the truth remained. That night, as the pack settled into sleep and the fires in the great hall burned low, Draven stood once more at his study window, staring out at the guest house where two strangers slept, unaware of the storm their arrival had stirred within him. He thought of Elena's laughter, of her eyes, of the name Ivy had described, soft and broken, whispered into the darkness by a mother who carried grief too heavy to speak aloud in daylight. He did not yet have proof. He did not yet have certainty. But hope, dangerous and persistent, had taken root inside him once again, and for the first time in 20 years, Draven Cross allowed himself to wonder if the family he believed he had lost forever might somehow, impossibly, have found its way back to him. Outside, beneath the same moon that had witnessed both tragedy and mystery, Ren stood alone by the window of the guest house, watching the light burning in the Alpha's study long into the night. She knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 20 years running from this exact moment, that the truth could no longer stay hidden much longer. And she was not certain, not even after all this time, whether that truth would bring healing or destruction to everyone she had sworn to protect. By the third day, whispers had already begun spreading through Blackthorn territory, quiet murmurs among warriors and elders alike, about the strange woman and her daughter who had arrived without warning, and captured the Alpha's attention in a way nothing had in 20 years. Ren felt every one of those whispers pressing against her like invisible weight, and she knew, with growing dread, that staying any longer would only make hiding the truth more difficult. She found Ivy near the training field that morning, watching a group of young warriors practice combat drills with quiet fascination. Ren approached quickly, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk," she said, guiding Ivy away from the crowd toward a quieter path near the tree line. "Are we leaving?" Ivy asked, her voice carrying a mixture of resignation and dread, the tone of someone who had learned to expect sudden departures as an unavoidable part of life. "Not yet," Ren said, though her tone suggested the decision weighed heavily on her. "But we need to be more careful. You cannot spend so much time speaking with the Alpha." Ivy frowned, confusion crossing her features. "Why not? He's been kind to me. Kinder than most Alphas I've met during our travels." Ren hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Kindness is not always safe," she said. "Sometimes, the people who seem safest are exactly the ones we must be most careful around." "That doesn't make sense," Ivy said, frustration creeping into her voice. "You always say this, but you never explain why. I'm not a child anymore, Mother. I deserve to understand why we live like this." Ren's expression softened with visible pain, though her resolve did not waver. "I promise you," she said quietly, "when the time is right, you will understand everything. But that time is not now, and definitely not here." Ivy wanted to argue further, but the look in her mother's eyes, exhausted and pleading, stopped her. She had seen that look many times before, in many different places, always accompanied by the same unspoken plea for trust without explanation. She nodded reluctantly, though frustration still simmered beneath the surface. Meanwhile, across the training field, Callum Hart watched the exchange from a distance, his sharp eyes missing none of the tension between mother and daughter. He had served as beta beside Draven for over 15 years, long enough to know his Alpha's moods better than most, and long enough to recognize when something significant was happening beneath the surface of ordinary events. He had known Elena too, years ago, before the attack that changed everything. He remembered her warmth, her laughter, the way she had softened Draven's naturally guarded personality during their years together. He remembered the devastation that followed her disappearance, the way Draven had slowly transformed from a passionate young Alpha into the disciplined, emotionally distant king he had become. And now, watching Ivy's expressions, her mannerisms, the particular way she tilted her head when confused, Callum felt an unsettling sense of recognition creeping through him. the same feeling that had bothered him since the moment he first saw her at the gate. He made his way toward the Pack Archives that afternoon, a small stone building near the edge of the territory where old records, maps, and historical documents were carefully preserved. He had a theory forming in his mind, one he was not yet ready to share with Draven, until he had gathered enough information to either confirm or dismiss his growing suspicion. The archivist, an elderly wolf named Faye, greeted him with mild surprise as he entered. "Beta Hart," she said, setting down the book she had been organizing. "It's rare to see you here. What brings you to the archives?" "I need records from 20 years ago," Callum said. "Specifically, anything related to the attack on our northern border, and any reports of survivors or refugees from that time." Faye's expression grew thoughtful as she moved toward a set of tall wooden shelves lined with aging documents. "That was a difficult period," she said, pulling several folders from the shelf. "So many records were damaged during the fire that swept through parts of our territory that night. But I kept what I could preserve." She spread the documents across a nearby table, and Callum began sorting through them carefully, searching for any mention of survivors who might have fled the territory in the chaos following the attack. Most records confirmed what he already knew: the timeline of the attack, the extent of the damage, the list of confirmed casualties, and the tragic absence of any trace of Elena's fate. But buried within one folder, he found something unexpected. A brief report, filed weeks after the attack by a Border Patrol unit, describing a sighting of an unidentified wounded woman, traveling with a young female companion, near the southern edge of Blackthorn territory. The report noted that the patrol had attempted to approach, but the women had fled before contact could be made, disappearing into dense forest terrain before backup arrived. Callum's pulse quickened as he read the timeline. The sighting had occurred less than a month after the attack that took Elena from them. He carried the document to a quiet corner of the archive, reading it several more times, his mind racing through possibilities. It could mean nothing, he told himself. Refugees and displaced wolves were not uncommon during periods of conflict between packs, but the timing, combined with everything else he had observed over the past few days, felt far too significant to dismiss as mere coincidence. He decided against bringing this information to Draven immediately. His alpha was already emotionally compromised by the situation, and Callum understood the danger of presenting incomplete information that might raise hopes only to shatter them later, if his suspicions proved wrong. He needed more evidence before speaking, more certainty before disturbing the fragile peace Draven had built around his grief over the years. That evening, Callum sought out Wren directly, finding her alone, near the small garden behind the guest quarters, tending to a patch of wildflowers with careful, practiced movements that suggested this was a habit she carried wherever she traveled. "Miss Wren," he said, approaching slowly to avoid startling her. "May I speak with you privately?" Wren straightened, her expression immediately guarded. "Beta Hart," she said carefully. "Is something wrong?" "I have questions," Callum said, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening despite the urgency building inside him. "About your past. About where you and your daughter have traveled from before arriving here." Wren's hands stilled among the flowers, though she did not turn to face him fully. "I have already explained to your alpha that our past is not relevant to our stay here," she said. "We seek only temporary shelter, nothing more." "I understand your caution," Callum said gently, "but I knew someone once, many years ago, someone very close to our alpha. And your daughter bears a resemblance to her that is difficult to ignore." Wren finally turned to face him, and for a brief moment, something raw and vulnerable flickered across her features before she carefully masked it once again. "Resemblances happen," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "They mean nothing." "Perhaps," Callum said, "but I found a report today, from 20 years ago, describing 2 women, seen fleeing through our southern border shortly after the attack, that took Elena from us. I believe you may know something about that report." Wren's face went pale, and for several long seconds she said nothing at all, her eyes darting toward the guest house where Ivy remained, unaware of the conversation taking place outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You do not understand what you are asking," she said. "There are reasons things have been kept hidden, reasons far more complicated than you realize. If the truth comes out carelessly, it could put everyone in danger, including the very people you are trying to protect." "Then help me understand," Callum said, his voice softening further. I do not wish to cause harm. I only wish to know the truth, for the sake of my Alpha, who has carried grief for 20 years without any answers at all. Ren closed her eyes briefly, visibly struggling with some internal decision that had clearly weighed on her for a very long time. I made a promise, she said finally. A promise I intend to keep, no matter how difficult it becomes. But I will tell you this much, Beta Heart. The truth you are searching for is far closer than you realize, and far more dangerous than either of you understand. Before Callum could press further, Ren turned and walked quickly back toward the guest house, leaving him standing alone in the fading evening light, her words echoing through his mind with unsettling weight. He returned to his own quarters that night, staring at the report he had found in the archives, turning Ren's words over and over in his thoughts. Far closer than you realize. Far more dangerous than either of you understand. The words felt less like a denial, and more like a warning, one that suggested the truth, whatever it was, carried consequences far beyond a simple reunion between a lost mate and a grieving Alpha. Meanwhile, inside the guest house, Ren sat beside Ivy's sleeping form, watching her daughter's peaceful breathing, with tears silently sliding down her face. She reached into a small worn bag she carried everywhere, retrieving an old, faded photograph she had protected for 20 years, through countless journeys and countless narrow escapes. The photograph showed a younger version of herself standing beside another woman, their arms linked together, both smiling, despite the visible exhaustion and fear in their eyes. Behind them, barely visible in the frame, stood the edge of a burning building, smoke curling into a darkened sky. I'm sorry, Ren whispered to the photograph, her voice breaking with the weight of 2 decades of secrecy. I tried to keep my promise. I tried to keep you both safe, but I don't know how much longer I can carry this alone. Outside, the moon rose higher over Blackthorn territory, illuminating a pack unknowingly standing at the edge of a truth that had remained buried for 20 long years, a truth that was about to change everything, for better or for far, far worse. Early the next morning, before most of the pack had risen, Draven found himself unable to remain in his study any longer. Sleep had eluded him for most of the night, his mind circling endlessly around the fragments of information he had gathered over the past few days, each piece insufficient on its own, but together forming a picture too compelling to ignore. He walked toward Callum's quarters, intending to discuss the growing list of unanswered questions surrounding their guests, only to find his Beta already awake, sitting at his desk with several old documents spread before him. You look as though you haven't slept, Draven observed, stepping inside. Neither have you, Callum replied, gesturing toward a chair. Sit. There is something you need to see. Draven's chest tightened as he crossed the room, sensing immediately that whatever Callum had discovered carried significant weight. He took the offered seat, watching as his Beta slid a worn document across the desk toward him. A Border Patrol report, Callum explained, filed weeks after the attack. 2 unidentified women were spotted near our southern border, one visibly wounded, traveling together, before disappearing into the forest. The timeline matches almost exactly with when we lost contact with Elena. Draven's hands trembled slightly as he read the report, his eyes scanning the brief clinical description over and over, searching for details that might confirm or deny the hope building rapidly within his chest. Why was I never told about this? He asked, his voice tight with restrained emotion. The search parties combing the forests at the time never found any further trace, Callum said carefully. The report was filed, and eventually forgotten among hundreds of others from that chaotic period. I only found it because I went searching specifically for anything related to survivors. And Ren? Draven asked. Have you spoken with her? Callum hesitated before answering. I have, he said. She did not confirm anything directly, but her reaction told me more than words ever could. She said the truth was closer than we realized, and more dangerous than we understood. Draven rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room with restless energy, his mind racing through implications he had not allowed himself to fully consider until now. Dangerous how? He asked. Dangerous to whom? I don't know, Callum admitted, but I believe she is protecting someone, possibly protecting all of us, by keeping certain truths hidden. Whatever happened 20 years ago, I don't think the full story has ever been told. Draven stopped pacing, staring out the window toward the guest quarters where Ren and Ivy still slept, unaware of the conversation unfolding about them. I need to speak with her directly, he said finally. No more careful questions. No more patience. I need answers, Callum, regardless of how dangerous the truth might be. Be careful, Callum warned. If she has spent 20 years hiding something this significant, pushing too hard too quickly might cause her to run before we learn anything at all. Draven nodded slowly, forcing himself to consider his beta's caution, despite the urgency burning inside him. 20 years of patience had brought him nothing but grief and unanswered questions, but he understood, even through the storm of hope and fear clouding his judgment, that carelessness now could cost him the very answers he desperately sought. He left Callum's quarters resolved to approach Ren carefully, deliberately, giving her space to reveal the truth on her own terms, rather than forcing a confrontation that might drive her away entirely. But as the day progressed, and he watched Ren grow increasingly anxious, glancing constantly toward the horizon as though preparing for a sudden departure, he understood that time was running short. By evening, his fears were confirmed. He found Ren packing a small bag inside the guest house, her movements quick and purposeful, while Ivy stood nearby, confusion and frustration written clearly across her young face. We're leaving, Ivy said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion as Draven entered. Again, without any explanation, as always. Draven's eyes met Ren's, and in that moment, he saw not defiance but genuine fear. Please, he said quietly, don't leave. Not yet. Ren paused, her hands still gripping the strap of her bag, her entire body tense with the weight of a decision she had clearly been wrestling with for hours. Staying is dangerous, she said, her voice barely steady. For all of us. Then explain why, Draven said, taking a careful step closer. Let me understand the danger before you disappear again, and take with you answers I have waited 20 years to find. Ren's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, her gaze shifting briefly to Ivy, before returning to Draven, with an expression of profound exhaustion. You don't understand what you're asking me to risk, she whispered. Then help me understand, Draven said, his voice softening into something closer to a plea than a command. Please. For a long, tense moment, silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of unanswered questions and unspoken fears. Finally, Ren lowered the bag from her shoulder, her resolve visibly crumbling under the weight of a secret she had carried alone for far too long. Not tonight, she said quietly, but soon. I promise you, Alpha Cross, the truth is coming, whether I am ready to share it or not. It has been chasing us for 20 years, and I fear it has finally caught up. Draven nodded, understanding that this fragile agreement was the closest thing to progress he would achieve tonight. As he left the guest house, his heart pounded with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that whatever truth awaited him would change everything, for better or for devastatingly worse. 3 days passed since Ren had agreed to stay, 3 days filled with tension, so thick it seemed to hang over Blackthorn territory like a storm cloud refusing to break. Draven kept his distance during that time, honoring the fragile trust he had built, though every moment away from answers felt like torture after 20 years of uncertainty. He busied himself with pack duties, forcing his attention onto border patrols, trade negotiations, and council meetings, though his mind never fully left the guest house at the edge of his territory. Ivy, meanwhile, had grown increasingly restless, sensing the tension surrounding her mother, without understanding its source. She spent her mornings wandering the training grounds, watching warriors practice with fascination, and her afternoons sketching in her notebook beneath the old oak tree that had quickly become her favorite spot within the territory. It was during one such afternoon that Grace, the elder council member who had noticed Draven's distraction days earlier, approached Ivy with careful curiosity. She lowered herself onto the grass beside the girl, studying her sketches with genuine interest. You have quite a talent, Grace said, admiring the detailed drawing of the training field spread across the page. Ivy looked up, offering a small smile. Thank you, she said. Drawing helps me feel steady, especially when things around me keep changing. You've traveled a great deal, I imagine, Grace said gently, though her tone carried careful curiosity, rather than intrusive prying. My whole life, Ivy admitted. I don't remember ever staying anywhere long enough to call it home, not really. This is the longest we've stayed anywhere in years. Grace nodded thoughtfully, studying the girl's features with growing certainty that mirrored the suspicions already circulating quietly among the pack's senior members. "May I ask you something personal?" she said carefully. "I suppose," Ivy said, setting down her pencil. "Has your mother ever mentioned the name Elena?" Grace asked, watching Ivy's reaction closely. Ivy's expression shifted immediately, surprise flickering across her features. "How do you know that name?" she asked. "My mother says it sometimes, very quietly, usually when she thinks I can't hear her." Grace's heart clenched with a mixture of sorrow and cautious hope. "Elena was someone very important to our Alpha," she said carefully. "Someone he lost a very long time ago." Ivy's brow furrowed with confusion, processing this information alongside the fragmented pieces of her own family history that had never fully made sense to her. "My mother has never told me who Elena is," she said, "but she cries that name sometimes at night. I always thought maybe it was an old friend she lost." "Perhaps," Grace said gently, though her tone suggested she believed the connection ran far deeper than simple friendship. Before their conversation could continue further, Ren appeared at the edge of the training field, her expression tightening with visible alarm as she noticed her daughter deep in conversation with one of the pack's senior elders. She crossed the distance quickly, her voice carrying a note of urgency as she reached them. "Ivy," she said, "it's time to come inside." "Mother, Grace was just telling me about someone named Elena," Ivy said, unaware of the tension radiating from her mother's rigid posture. Ren's face paled visibly, and for a brief moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked entirely. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling slightly, as she reached for Ivy's arm. "Ren," Grace said calmly, rising to her feet, "I did not mean to upset you. I only wondered if there was a connection worth exploring, for everyone's sake, including your own." "You don't understand what you're risking by asking these questions," Ren said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Please, I am begging you, leave this alone." Grace studied her for a long moment, sensing genuine fear rather than simple evasiveness. "I mean no harm," she said gently. "But our Alpha has suffered greatly for 20 years, not knowing what became of the woman he loved. If there is any chance of bringing him peace, don't you think he deserves that chance, regardless of the risk?" Ren's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might finally break her long silence. But instead, she simply shook her head, pulling Ivy gently away from the elder and leading her quickly back toward the guest quarters, leaving Grace standing alone, with unanswered questions, and growing certainty that something significant and dangerous lay hidden beneath the surface of Ren's careful secrecy. That evening, Grace requested an urgent meeting with Draven, finding him in his study, reviewing border reports, with visible exhaustion etched across his features. She wasted no time with formalities, recounting her conversation with Ivy and the fear that had overtaken Ren the moment Elena's name was mentioned. Draven listened in silence, his hands clenched tightly against the surface of his desk, every word confirming suspicions he had carried for days, but had not yet dared to fully accept. "I believe," Grace said carefully, "that Ren knows exactly what happened to Elena 20 years ago. And I believe she has spent this entire time protecting a secret that terrifies her deeply." "Protecting it from whom?" Draven asked, his voice rough with restrained emotion. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "But her fear seemed genuine, Alpha. Whatever she is protecting Ivy from, it is not something she takes lightly." Draven rose from his desk, walking toward the window that overlooked the darkened territory beyond. Somewhere out there, in the small guest house at the edge of his lands, a woman held answers that could either heal or completely shatter the fragile peace he had built around his grief. "I cannot continue waiting patiently," he said finally, his voice firm with resolve. 20 years of patience has brought me nothing but unanswered questions. Tomorrow, I intend to speak with Ren directly, and I will not leave that conversation without the truth, regardless of how difficult or dangerous it proves to be. Grace nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of his decision. "Be prepared, Alpha," she said quietly. "Whatever truce awaits, you may not be simple, and it may not bring the peace you are hoping for." Draven turned to face her, his expression hardened with determination, despite the vulnerability visible beneath the surface. "I have lived 20 years without peace," he said. "I would rather face a difficult truth than continue living within a comfortable uncertainty that has cost me everything that ever mattered. The following morning arrived with an unusual stillness across Blackthorn territory, as though the pack itself sensed the significance of the day ahead. Draven rose before dawn, dressing carefully, his mind rehearsing questions he had waited 2 decades to ask, though he knew no amount of preparation could fully ready him for whatever truth Ren might finally reveal. He found her waiting outside the guest house, as though she too had anticipated this confrontation, her expression calm, despite the visible exhaustion shadowing her eyes. Ivy was nowhere in sight, and Draven suspected Ren had deliberately ensured her daughter remained occupied elsewhere during this conversation. "You've decided to stop waiting," Ren said quietly as he approached. "I have," Draven said. "I need the truth, Ren. All of it, regardless of the consequences." Ren studied him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting years of accumulated grief, fear, and the exhausting weight of a promise she had carried alone for far too long. Finally, she nodded slowly, gesturing toward a nearby bench beneath a cluster of trees, away from prying eyes and listening ears. "Sit with me," she said. "This story deserves more than a hurried conversation in passing, and once I begin, Alpha Cross, I need you to understand that everything is about to change, for you, for Ivy, and for this entire pack." Draven lowered himself onto the bench beside her, his heart pounding with anticipation 20 years in the making. Ren closed her eyes briefly, gathering the courage to finally release the secret she had protected through countless sleepless nights and desperate journeys across unfamiliar territories. 20 years ago, she began, her voice steady, despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "I found a woman, lying wounded, at the edge of a forest, barely alive, surrounded by the aftermath of destruction I still struggle to fully describe. She was terrified, Alpha Cross, more terrified than anyone I had ever encountered, and she made me promise something that has shaped every decision I have made since that day." Draven's breath caught in his throat, his entire body going rigid with anticipation. "Elena," he whispered. Ren nodded slowly, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, as 20 years of carefully guarded silence began to crumble beneath the weight of long overdue truth. "Yes," she said softly. "Elena survived that night. And Alpha Cross, there is so much more you need to understand before I can explain why she has remained hidden from you for all these years." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would soon reshape everything Draven believed about the tragedy that had defined the last 20 years of his life. He wanted to demand immediate answers, to understand every detail at once, but he forced himself to remain still, recognizing that Ren needed to tell this story in her own way, at her own pace, if he hoped to understand the full and complicated truth behind her long silence. "Tell me everything," he said quietly, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "Please." And so, beneath the quiet shade of the trees, with 20 years of grief finally beginning to unravel, Ren began to share the story she had protected so fiercely, a story that would soon change the course of Draven's life, and the future of Blackthorn Pack, forever. Ren drew a slow breath, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, as though pulling the memory forward required physically reaching into the past. "I was not part of any pack back then," she said. "I lived alone, traveling between territories, avoiding attachment, because attachment had cost me dearly in my younger years. That night, I was passing through the southern edge of your lands, when I saw the smoke rising against the sky, thick and black, swallowing the stars." Draven's jaw tightened, memories of that same night rushing back with painful clarity, the chaos, the screaming, the desperate search through flames that had given him nothing but ash and silence. "I followed the smoke," Ren continued, "not out of courage, but out of instinct, the kind that tells you something significant is happening, and you cannot simply walk away. That's when I found her, near a collapsed ridge at the edge of the forest, barely conscious, wounded so severely, I nearly believed she would not survive the night." "Why didn't she return to the pack?" Draven asked, his voice tight, with a mixture of confusion and old grief resurfacing violently. "Why didn't anyone bring her home?" Ren's expression grew heavier, sorrow deepening the lines around her eyes. "Because in the brief moments she remained conscious," she said, "Elena told me something that terrified her more than her injuries. She said the attack had not come from outside enemies alone. She said someone within your own pack had opened the gates, had guided the attackers directly to the places most vulnerable, most devastating. She believed, Alpha Cross, that returning immediately would mean walking straight back into danger, possibly danger aimed specifically at her and anyone connected to her. Draven felt the ground shift beneath him, the foundation of everything he believed about that terrible night crumbling into something far more sinister than simple misfortune. A traitor, he said quietly, the word tasting bitter and unfamiliar on his tongue. Someone within Blackthorn betrayed us. She was not certain who, Ren said, only that someone highly trusted had access to information that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. She feared that if she returned before understanding who this traitor was, she would be walking directly into their hands, and possibly endangering you as well, since she believed you were likely a target too, not simply a victim of circumstance. Draven's mind raced, connecting fragments of memory he had never fully examined, decisions during that night that had seemed strange even then, but had been buried beneath the overwhelming weight of grief and chaos. So she asked you to hide her, he said slowly, understanding beginning to take shape. She begged me, Ren corrected gently. She was barely conscious, terrified, and utterly certain that returning would cost her life, and possibly yours as well. I could not refuse someone in that state, someone who had lost everything, except the instinct to survive and protect the people she loved. I promised her I would help her disappear, help her heal, and keep her hidden until she felt it was safe to return. 20 years, Draven said, his voice breaking slightly. You kept that promise for 20 years. She healed slowly, Ren continued, tears sliding freely down her cheeks now. Physically at least. But the fear never left her, not completely. And then she discovered she was carrying your child, and everything changed once again. She became even more determined to remain hidden, terrified that revealing herself, or the existence of her daughter, would place both of you directly in danger from whoever had orchestrated that attack. Draven's chest tightened painfully at the mention of Ivy, understanding now, with devastating clarity, exactly why the girl's eyes had haunted him from the very first moment he saw her. Ivy, he whispered. She is truly mine. Ren nodded slowly. Elena gave birth to her in hiding, she said. Far from any pack, far from anyone who might recognize the danger surrounding them. She loved Ivy more fiercely than I have ever witnessed anyone love another person. But that love was tangled tightly with fear, a fear that never allowed her to feel safe enough to return home, even after so many years had passed. Where is she now? Draven asked, his voice trembling with desperate urgency. Where is Elena? Ren hesitated, glancing around cautiously, as though the very question carried danger, simply by being spoken aloud. She is safe, she said carefully. Hidden in a location I am not yet ready to reveal, even to you. She grew too weak in recent years to continue traveling as we once did, and so she asked me to bring Ivy somewhere stable, somewhere with resources and protection, while she recovered her strength. Why here? Draven asked. Why Blackthorn, after all this time? Because Ivy is growing older, Ren said, and Elena could no longer bear keeping her hidden from the truth of who she is, or from the father who deserves to know his daughter exists. She sent us here, Alpha Cross, hoping that by now, enough time had passed, that whatever danger once existed might have faded, or at least become identifiable enough to finally confront. Draven sat in stunned silence, processing 20 years of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions, colliding suddenly with hope, so overwhelming it left him breathless. His mate was alive. His daughter sat beneath an oak tree, only a short distance away, sketching quietly, unaware that the man she had spoken with so casually over the past few days was, in truth, her father. I need to see her, he said finally, his voice raw with emotion. I need to see Elena. I understand, Ren said gently. But please, Alpha Cross, we must proceed carefully. If a traitor truly exists within your pack, revealing everything too quickly could place Elena, Ivy, and everyone connected to this truth in serious danger. We have survived this long through caution. I am asking you to trust that caution just a little longer, until we understand exactly who among your people cannot be trusted. Draven nodded slowly, though every instinct within him screamed to act immediately, to demand answers, to rush toward reunion regardless of risk. But 20 years of discipline, 20 years of learning to control impulsive emotion for the sake of his pack's safety, allowed him to recognize the wisdom in Ren's warning. Then help me identify this traitor, he said finally, his voice hardening with renewed purpose. Because I refuse to spend one more day living in fear of an enemy hiding within my own walls, especially now that I understand what, and who, that enemy has already cost me. Ren studied him for a long moment, seeing not just grief and hope reflected in his expression, but a fierce determination that reminded her powerfully of the woman she had protected for 20 long years. Then we begin together, she said quietly, because this truth, once fully uncovered, will change everything, for all of us. As the afternoon light shifted golden across the quiet clearing, Draven Cross sat with the weight of 20 years finally beginning to lift, replaced by a new and dangerous purpose. Somewhere within his own trusted circle, someone had betrayed everything he held dear, and now, with his mate alive and his daughter finally within reach, he intended to uncover that betrayal, no matter the cost required to protect the family he had only just begun to reclaim. News that could not yet be spoken aloud settled over Draven like a second heartbeat, present in every breath, every glance toward the guest house, where his daughter remained unaware of the truth that had just reshaped both their lives. He returned to his study that evening with Callum summoned immediately, the door closed firmly behind them, ensuring no one else within the pack could overhear what needed to be discussed. Elena is alive, Draven said the moment Callum entered, his voice still trembling slightly with the weight of the revelation. Ivy is my daughter, and someone within our own pack betrayed us 20 years ago. Callum stood frozen for a long moment, absorbing information that shattered 2 decades of accepted history within seconds. Say that again, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Draven repeated everything Ren had shared, watching as his beta's expression shifted through disbelief, sorrow, and finally, a hardened determination that mirrored his own. A traitor, Callum said slowly. Someone with access to sensitive information. Someone trusted enough to know our defenses well enough to guide an attack directly toward our most vulnerable points. That narrows the possibilities considerably, Draven said. Only a handful of individuals held that level of access 20 years ago, and most of them remain within our council or command structure today. Callum began pacing the room, his mind working quickly through possibilities. We need to review who held command positions during that period, he said, who had access to territory maps, patrol schedules, defense strategies. If someone opened the gates deliberately, they would have needed detailed knowledge that only a small circle of trusted individuals possessed. I want a full list by morning, Draven said. Every individual who held any position of authority or access 20 years ago, cross-referenced against who remains active within our pack today. Callum nodded, already turning toward the door before pausing, his expression troubled. Draven, he said quietly, using his alpha's given name rather than his title, a habit reserved only for their most private conversations. If this traitor still holds a position of trust within our pack, revealing what we know too quickly could give them warning enough to either flee or, worse, act again before we identify them. I understand the risk, Draven said. We proceed quietly. No accusations without solid evidence. But I will not allow this investigation to move slowly, simply out of caution. Every day, this traitor remains hidden, is another day Elena remains unsafe. Another day my family remains separated by fear, rather than truth. Callum left shortly after, beginning the discreet work of gathering old records and current pack rosters, cross-referencing decades-old assignments against present-day positions of authority. Draven remained alone in his study long into the night, staring at the same faded photograph of Elena he had kept hidden for 20 years, though now, for the first time, hope had replaced pure grief in his expression. The following morning, Draven sought out Ivy earlier than usual, finding her exactly where he expected, seated beneath the old oak tree, with her notebook open across her lap. He approached slowly, his heart pounding, with an entirely different kind of anticipation than he had felt during their previous conversations. "Good morning," he said, lowering himself onto the grass beside her, closer than he had allowed himself before. Ivy looked up, offering her usual polite smile, though something in his expression seemed to catch her attention immediately. "You look different today," she observed. "Happier maybe, or maybe just less tired." "Perhaps both," Draven admitted, unable to fully suppress the emotion building within him as he studied her features. searching for every trace of Elena he could now recognize with absolute certainty. My mother seemed different too, Ivy said. Quieter. She's been crying more than usual, though she tries to hide it from me. Draven's chest tightened at the thought of Ren carrying this enormous secret alone for so many years, the emotional toll it must have taken on her despite her unwavering commitment to protecting Elena and Ivy. Your mother has carried a heavy burden, he said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate caution. One that involves people she cares about very deeply. Ivy studied him closely, perceptive beyond her years, despite her sheltered upbringing. You know something, she said. Something about my past that I don't know yet. Draven hesitated, torn between his desire to reveal everything immediately and his understanding that the truth needed to unfold carefully, with proper preparation, rather than through a sudden, overwhelming revelation that might frighten or confuse her. There are things I am learning, he said finally. Things that concern your family, and mine. But I promise you, Ivy, when the time is right, you will understand everything completely. Ivy frowned, clearly frustrated by yet another vague answer, though something in Draven's gentle tone seemed to soften her irritation slightly. Everyone keeps saying that, she said. My mother, and now you. When exactly is this mysterious right time supposed to arrive? Soon? Draven promised, reaching out hesitantly before withdrawing his hand, uncertain whether such a gesture would be appropriate, given that Ivy did not yet know their true connection. I give you my word, soon you will have every answer you deserve. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Callum, his expression tight with urgency as he approached. Alpha, he said, may I speak with you privately? Draven excused himself, following Callum a short distance away, out of Ivy's hearing range. What did you find? He asked immediately. Several names emerged from cross-referencing old assignment records, Callum said, keeping his voice low. But one stands out significantly above the others. Victor Lang. Draven's expression darkened immediately at the mention of the name. Victor Lang served as one of his most trusted advisors, a member of the Inner Council who had held increasing influence over PAC affairs during the past 2 decades, particularly following the chaos of the attack that had claimed Elena and devastated much of the PAC's leadership structure. Victor gained significant power in the aftermath of that attack, Callum continued. He was among the few survivors of the original command structure, and his position allowed him to reshape much of our internal governance during the years following the tragedy. He benefited directly from the chaos, Draven said slowly, pieces beginning to align with disturbing clarity. The attack that destroyed our previous leadership structure also happened to elevate his own influence considerably. There's more, Callum said grimly. I found records showing Victor requested and received detailed territory maps and patrol schedules just days before the attack occurred, citing routine security review as justification. At the time, no one questioned it, given his position. But looking at it now, alongside everything else we've learned, the timing feels far too convenient to dismiss as coincidence. Draven's hands clenched into fists at his sides, fury building slowly beneath his controlled exterior. 20 years, he said quietly, his voice trembling with restrained rage. 20 years, I trusted this man, consulted him, allowed him influence over decisions that shaped our entire PAC, while he may have been responsible for the single greatest tragedy this PAC has ever endured. We don't have absolute proof yet, Callum cautioned. Suspicious timing and convenient access are not the same as confirmed guilt. We need more concrete evidence before making any accusations, especially against someone holding as much influence as Victor currently possesses. Draven forced himself to take a slow, steadying breath, recognizing the wisdom in his beta's caution despite the fury burning within him. Then we gather that evidence, he said finally, quietly, carefully, without alerting him to our suspicions. If Victor is truly responsible, I want undeniable proof before I confront him. Proof strong enough to ensure justice, not simply accusation based on circumstantial connections. Callum nodded in agreement, though his expression remained troubled. There's something else you should consider, he said carefully. If Victor was indeed responsible for orchestrating that attack, and he learns that Elena survived, or that Ivy exists as living proof of his failure to eliminate your bloodline entirely, he may see them as an ongoing threat to his position and his freedom. We need to protect them immediately, not just investigate carefully. The realization struck Draven with sudden, sickening clarity. If Victor had betrayed the pack once to consolidate power, he would likely see Ivy, and potentially Elena, as loose ends requiring elimination should the truth ever threaten to surface. Every day that passed without resolution placed his newly rediscovered family in continued danger. "Increase security around the guest quarters immediately," Draven ordered, his voice hardening with protective determination. "Discreetly. I don't want to raise suspicion, but I want Ren and Ivy protected at all times, without exception." "I'll handle it personally," Callum said, already turning to carry out the order. As his beta departed, Draven remained standing alone, staring toward the oak tree where Ivy had returned to her sketching, utterly unaware of the danger potentially surrounding her, or the identity of the man responsible for the tragedy that had shaped her entire hidden existence. 20 years of grief had finally given way to hope, but that hope now carried with it a dangerous new burden, the responsibility of protecting everything he had only just begun to reclaim. He watched his daughter for a long moment, memorizing details he had missed for 19 years of her life, promising himself silently that he would do whatever necessary to ensure she never again had to live in fear, hidden away from the family and legacy that rightfully belonged to her. The investigation had only just begun, but Draven understood, with absolute certainty, that the coming days would test his pack's strength, his own resolve, and the fragile hope of reunion he had waited 2 decades to experience, in ways he could not yet fully imagine. Elsewhere within Blackthorn territory, Victor Lang sat within his private study, reviewing routine council documents with the calm efficiency that had defined his reputation for the past 20 years. He was a tall man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes, respected among the council for his strategic mind and his steady leadership during the difficult years following the attack that had reshaped the pack's entire command structure. Few within Blackthorn remembered the ambitious young advisor he had once been, overshadowed constantly by Draven's father, and later by Draven himself, always positioned just outside the innermost circle of true power despite his considerable talents. Fewer still suspected the depth of resentment he had carried for years before finally acting upon it, resentment born from decades of being overlooked despite his unwavering loyalty and service. A soft knock interrupted his review, and he looked up to find one of his most trusted informants, a younger wolf named Nolan, who had served as his personal aide for several years, entering with visible unease. "You wanted updates on the newcomers," Nolan said, closing the door carefully behind him. "Beta Hart has been spending considerable time in the archives recently, reviewing old records from 20 years ago." Victor's expression remained carefully neutral, though something sharp flickered briefly behind his calculating eyes. "What kind of records?" he asked. "Border Patrol reports," Nolan said, "specifically from the weeks following the attack that claimed Elena." He also requested information regarding personnel assignments and access privileges from that same period. Victor set down the document he had been reviewing, his fingers tapping slowly against the surface of his desk as he processed this information with growing unease. 20 years of careful maintenance of his reputation, 20 years of ensuring no lingering evidence remained to connect him to that devastating night, suddenly felt considerably less secure. "And the Alpha?" Victor asked carefully. "Has he shown particular interest in these newcomers as well?" "Considerable interest," Nolan confirmed. "He has spent significant time with the girl, and security around the guest quarters was quietly increased just this morning, though no official explanation was given." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his mind racing through possibilities and potential consequences with the same calculated precision that had guided every careful decision he had made over the past 20 years. If Draven had somehow discovered a connection between these strangers and Elena's disappearance, the fragile position Victor had spent 2 decades constructing could collapse entirely, along with everything he had worked to achieve. "Keep watching," Victor instructed, his voice remaining deceptively calm, despite the storm building within him. "Report anything further you learn, no matter how insignificant it might seem." Nolan nodded and departed quickly, leaving Victor alone with thoughts that grew increasingly dark and calculating with each passing moment. He rose from his desk, moving toward the window that overlooked much of the pack's central territory, his gaze drifting instinctively toward the guest quarters visible in the distance. 20 years ago, he had made a decision he believed necessary, a decision that had cost lives but had also elevated him into a position of influence and respect he had spent his entire life striving to achieve. He had convinced himself, over the years, that the outcome justified the sacrifice, that his subsequent leadership had strengthened Blackthorn far beyond what would have been possible under the previous, more cautious command structure. But if the truth surfaced now, none of that carefully constructed justification would matter. He would lose everything: his position, his reputation, his freedom, and quite possibly his life, given the severity of the betrayal he had committed against his own pack. He could not allow that to happen, not after everything he had sacrificed to reach this position. Not when he was finally close enough to the true seat of power that further opportunities for advancement seemed within reach. Victor turned away from the window, his expression hardening into something colder and more determined than the careful diplomatic mask he typically presented to the world. Whatever threat these newcomers represented, whatever information Beta Hart was uncovering within the archives, he intended to address it swiftly and decisively, before the truth could unravel everything he had built. He moved toward a hidden compartment within his desk, retrieving a small collection of documents he had kept carefully concealed for 20 years, insurance against exactly this kind of discovery. Among them were details regarding several other individuals who had assisted him during that fateful night, individuals who remained loyal to him even now, bound by shared guilt and mutual self-preservation. It was time, he decided, to reach out to those old allies once again, to ensure that whatever threat this mysterious woman and her daughter represented could be neutralized before Draven Cross uncovered the truth that would destroy everything Victor had spent 2 decades carefully constructing. As evening settled over Blackthorn territory, 2 separate plans began taking shape within the same walls, one born from desperate hope and the desire for justice long overdue, the other born from fear and the ruthless determination to protect a secret at any cost necessary. Neither side yet fully understood the danger the coming days would bring, but both recognized, with growing certainty, that the fragile peace surrounding Blackthorn Pack was rapidly approaching its breaking point. 2 days after Ren's revelation, Draven found himself standing before Owen, the pack healer, requesting something he had never openly asked for before: a private lineage examination, conducted under the guise of routine registration procedures required for all long-term guests within Blackthorn territory. "You want me to test her bloodline," Owen said carefully, understanding immediately the true purpose behind Draven's request, despite the careful wording used to disguise it. "Against your own." "Quietly," Draven confirmed, without drawing attention from anyone else within the pack, including the council. Owen studied his alpha for a long moment, recognizing the barely contained hope and fear warring behind Draven's controlled expression. He had served the pack for many years, long enough to remember Elena clearly, long enough to notice the same unsettling resemblance in Ivy that others had already begun whispering about throughout the territory. "I can arrange it," Owen said finally. "I will need a small sample from both of you, easily obtained under the pretense of standard health documentation. The results should be ready within a day." "Thank you," Draven said, relief evident despite his attempt to maintain composure. "This must remain completely confidential until I determine how best to proceed." "Of course," Owen agreed, "though I suspect, Alpha, that you already know what these results will confirm." Draven did not respond immediately, though the truth of Owen's observation settled heavily within him. He had known, somewhere deep within his instincts, from the very first moment he looked into Ivy's eyes beneath the oak tree. But knowing something instinctively and having concrete confirmation were entirely different experiences, and he needed that confirmation before he could take the next steps required to reclaim his family safely. The sample collection proceeded exactly as planned, disguised carefully within routine health documentation that raised no suspicion from either Ren or Ivy, both of whom had already undergone similar procedures upon their initial arrival. Draven spent the following day consumed with restless anticipation, forcing himself through pack duties, while his mind remained fixed entirely on the results that would soon confirm what his heart had already accepted as truth. Late that evening, Owen requested a private meeting, his expression carefully neutral as Draven entered the healer's small clinic, though something in his posture suggested the significance of what he was about to share. "The results are conclusive," Owen said without preamble, sliding a folder across his desk. "Ivy is your biological daughter, Alpha Cross. The genetic markers align precisely with your bloodline. well beyond any possibility of coincidence. Draven's hands trembled as he opened the folder, staring at technical documentation he barely understood beyond the simple, devastating truth it confirmed. 20 years of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions collapsed suddenly beneath the undeniable weight of scientific certainty. Ivy was his daughter. Elena had survived. Everything Ren had shared was true. "I need to tell her," Draven said, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "Ivy deserves to know the truth immediately." "Perhaps," Owen said carefully, "though you should consider discussing this first with Ren, and ideally, with Elena herself if possible. Revealing something this significant requires careful preparation, especially for a young woman who has spent her entire life believing certain things about her family that are now proven false." Draven nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Owen's caution, despite the overwhelming urge to rush immediately toward his daughter and reveal everything without further delay. He thanked the healer and left the clinic, walking through the quiet darkness toward the guest quarters where Ren remained awake, as though anticipating exactly this conversation. She met him outside, her expression revealing that she already understood the purpose of his visit before he spoke a single word. "The results confirmed it," she said quietly. "It was not a question." "Yes," Draven said. "Ivy is my daughter. I need to tell her, Ren. I cannot continue pretending, watching her, speaking with her, while she remains completely unaware of who I truly am to her." Ren closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion and relief mingling visibly across her features. "I know," she said. "I have known this moment would arrive eventually, though I confess I hoped we would have more time to prepare properly, and more certainty regarding the danger surrounding us, before revealing everything." "We cannot wait indefinitely," Draven said. "Every day we delay is another day Ivy lives, without knowing her true family. Another day, Elena remains separated from the daughter she sacrificed everything to protect." Ren nodded slowly, understanding the truth in his words despite her lingering fears. "Then we tell her together," she said. "Tomorrow, when she is well rested, and we have privacy to explain everything properly, without interruption or unnecessary complication." Draven agreed, though sleep proved elusive that night, his mind racing through countless variations of how the conversation might unfold, how Ivy might react to learning that everything she believed about her family history had been carefully constructed to protect her from a danger she never knew existed. Morning arrived with unusual clarity, sunlight filtering gently through the trees surrounding Blackthorn territory, as though the world itself understood the significance of the day ahead. Draven met Ren outside the guest quarters, both visibly nervous despite their careful preparation for the conversation that would finally reveal the truth Ivy deserved to know. They found her inside, seated at a small table with her notebook open before her, though she set down her pencil immediately upon seeing both her mother and Draven entering together, their expressions carrying a seriousness that immediately captured her full attention. "What's happening?" Ivy asked, glancing between them with growing apprehension. "You're both looking at me like something terrible is about to happen." "Not terrible," Ren said gently, moving to sit beside her daughter, taking her hand carefully. "Something important. Something we should have told you a long time ago, though circumstances made that impossible until now." Ivy's eyes widened slightly, sensing the magnitude of whatever revelation awaited her. "Is this about Elena?" she asked. "The name I hear you cry sometimes at night." Ren nodded slowly, tears already beginning to form despite her attempt to remain composed for her daughter's sake. "Elena is not simply a friend I lost," she said carefully. "Ivy, Elena is your mother, your true mother. I am not your biological parent, though I have loved and protected you as fiercely as any mother could throughout your entire life." Ivy's face went pale, confusion and shock warring visibly across her features as she processed information that shattered the foundation of everything she believed about her own identity. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "You're not my mother?" "I am your mother, in every way that matters," Ren said quickly, gripping her daughter's hand tightly. "I raised you, protected you, loved you, every single day of your life. But biologically, you were born to a woman named Elena, who was severely wounded the night you were conceived, wounded during an attack that nearly claimed her life." Ivy turned toward Draven, understanding beginning to dawn slowly across her features, as pieces of fragmented information finally began aligning into a coherent, overwhelming picture. "And you," she said slowly. "You know Elena too." Draven knelt slowly before her, his own eyes filled with tears he no longer attempted to hide. "Ivy," he said, his voice trembling, with 20 years of accumulated grief and newfound joy colliding within a single moment. "Elena is my mate. 20 years ago, I believe she died during an attack on our territory. I have grieved her loss every single day since then, never imagining she survived, never imagining she carried a child, our child, into hiding, to protect her from danger. I am only now beginning to fully understand." Ivy's breath caught sharply, her entire body going still, as the full weight of the revelation settled over her. "You're my father," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Yes," Draven said, his voice breaking with overwhelming emotion. "I am your father, Ivy. I have been searching for answers my entire adult life, never imagining that answer would arrive walking through my gates, having traveled with me the entire time, without either of us realizing the truth." Tears streamed freely down Ivy's face as she absorbed a truth so significant it reshaped her entire understanding of herself, her family, and the strange, transient life she had lived, without ever fully understanding why. "All those years," she said, her voice trembling, "all those times we ran, hid, moved from place to place without explanation. It was because of this, because of you being my father, and someone dangerous existing, who wanted to hurt us because of that connection." "Yes," Ren confirmed gently. "Elena believed, and still believes, that revealing your existence too soon could place both you and your father in serious danger, from whoever orchestrated the attack that nearly killed her 20 years ago." Ivy turned back toward Draven, studying his features with new understanding, recognizing now the source of the strange familiarity she had felt since their very first conversation. "Is my mother safe?" she asked. "Elena? Is she truly alive?" "She is," Ren confirmed. "Though she remains hidden for now, recovering her strength and waiting for the right moment to reunite safely with both of you." "I want to see her," Ivy said immediately, determination overtaking her initial shock. "I want to meet my mother. Please. I've waited my entire life without understanding why my family felt so incomplete. I cannot wait any longer now that I finally understand the truth." Draven exchanged a glance with Ren, both recognizing the urgency and legitimacy of Ivy's request, despite the lingering danger that continued to complicate their situation. "We will arrange it," Draven promised. "As soon as it is safe to do so, you will meet your mother, and our family will finally be reunited properly. After 20 years of separation, none of us deserve to endure." Ivy nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks, though a small, tentative smile began forming, despite the overwhelming emotion of the morning. 20 years, she repeated softly. "I have a father who has been searching for me, without even knowing I existed, and a mother who sacrificed everything to keep me safe. I don't know whether to feel devastated or overjoyed." "Perhaps both," Draven said gently, echoing words he had spoken to her days earlier, without either of them understanding their true significance at the time. Grief and joy often exist together, especially when reunion follows such profound loss. As the morning continued, the three of them remained together, slowly beginning to build the foundation of a relationship that circumstance had denied them for far too long. Draven found himself overwhelmed with a happiness he had not experienced in 20 years, watching his daughter, finally acknowledged and embraced, begin asking questions about her heritage, her pack, and the father she was only just beginning to know. But even amid this long-awaited joy, a quiet unease remained present within Draven's thoughts. Somewhere within his own trusted circle, a traitor still walked freely, unaware that his carefully hidden secret was rapidly approaching exposure. And until that traitor was identified and neutralized, the reunion Draven had waited 20 years to experience remained fragile, threatened by a danger that had already cost his family 2 decades of stolen time together. He resolved, watching Ivy laugh softly at something Ren said, that he would not allow that danger to steal anything further from the family he had only just begun to reclaim. While the emotional reunion unfolded within the guest quarters, Callum continued his careful investigation into Victor Lang, working methodically through decades of records, with a patience that belied the urgency he felt building beneath the surface. He had enlisted the help of Faye, the archivist, swearing her to secrecy, given the sensitive nature of what they were uncovering. "Look at this," Faye said, sliding another document across the table toward him. A supply requisition, filed by Victor 3 days before the attack, requesting additional weapons be moved away from the northern storage facility for what he described as routine maintenance rotation. Callum studied the document carefully, his suspicion deepening with every new piece of evidence they uncovered. The northern storage facility was one of the first locations destroyed during the attack, he said slowly. If weapons had been moved away beforehand, under his direct order, that would have left our northern defenses critically weakened, exactly where the attackers focused their assault. "There's more," Faye said, pulling out several additional documents. Patrol schedules from that same week show unusual gaps along the northern border, gaps that were approved by Victor himself, citing training exercises that, according to these secondary records, never actually took place. Callum leaned back in his chair, processing the mounting evidence with a mixture of anger and grim satisfaction. Every piece confirmed what he and Draven had begun suspecting, that Victor Lang had systematically weakened Blackthorn's defenses in the days leading up to the attack, creating exactly the vulnerabilities that had allowed the rival pack's assault to succeed with such devastating efficiency. "This is enough to raise serious questions," Callum said, "but I want absolute certainty before we bring this to Draven. If we're wrong, or if Victor discovers our suspicions prematurely, the consequences could be severe, both for our investigation and for Ren and Ivy's safety." "What do you propose?" Faye asked. "I want to speak with anyone who served alongside Victor during that period," Callum said. "Someone who might remember details these documents alone cannot fully capture. Is there anyone still living within our territory who worked closely with him 20 years ago?" Faye considered the question carefully before her expression brightened with sudden recollection. "There is someone," she said. "An old warrior named Marcus, who served under Victor's command during that time. He retired from active duty years ago, but he still lives within our territory, in one of the smaller dwellings near the eastern boundary." "Take me to him," Callum said immediately, rising from his chair with renewed purpose. They found Marcus later that afternoon, an elderly wolf with weathered features and sharp, watchful eyes that suggested his mind remained as sharp as ever, despite his advanced age. He greeted them cautiously, clearly surprised by the unexpected visit from the pack's Beta. "Beta Heart," Marcus said, gesturing for them to sit within his modest home. "It's rare to receive such distinguished visitors. What brings you here?" "I need to ask you about the attack 20 years ago," Callum said carefully. "Specifically, about Victor Lang's role during that period, and any unusual instructions or decisions you might remember him making in the days leading up to that night." Marcus's expression shifted immediately, wariness replacing his initial surprise. "That's a dangerous question to be asking," he said quietly, "especially about someone as influential as Victor has become over the years." "I understand the risk," Callum said. "But I believe the truth about that night has never been fully told, and I believe you may hold information critical to understanding what truly happened." Marcus studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the consequences of speaking openly against decades of carefully maintained silence. Finally, he sighed heavily, the weight of long-suppressed memory visible across his aged features. "I always suspected something was wrong," he admitted. "The way our defenses failed so completely, so precisely at our weakest points. It never felt like simple misfortune to me. But Victor rose to power so quickly afterward, and questioning him felt dangerous, especially for someone in my position." "What do you remember specifically?" Callum pressed gently. "Victor called an unusual meeting 3 days before the attack," Marcus said slowly, memory clearly resurfacing with visible discomfort. "He requested detailed reports on our defensive capabilities, citing concerns about potential threats from a rival pack. At the time, it seemed like appropriate caution. Looking back now, with everything you're suggesting, it feels like reconnaissance rather than genuine concern." "Did he act alone?" Callum asked. "Or did others assist him in gathering this information?" Marcus hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable implicating additional individuals without absolute certainty. "There were a few others he consulted closely during that period," he admitted finally. "Younger warriors, ambitious ones, eager to prove their loyalty and advance within pack hierarchy. I don't know if they understood what they were truly participating in, or if they were simply following orders, without questioning the full implications." "Names," Callum said. I need names, Marcus, if you have them. Marcus provided several names. Individuals who had indeed advanced significantly within pack structure over the following years. Individuals who remained connected to Victor, even now, through various positions of trust and responsibility throughout Blackthorn territory. Callum thanked him for his cooperation, promising discretion regarding the source of this information, before departing with Faye toward the pack's central hall, his mind racing through the implications of what they had just learned. The conspiracy, if it existed as thoroughly as evidence now suggested, extended far beyond Victor alone, potentially involving multiple individuals who continued holding influential positions throughout the pack, even 20 years later. He needed to bring this information to Draven immediately, though he understood the delicate balance required moving forward. Confronting Victor prematurely, without absolute proof and a clear strategy for neutralizing potential allies who might attempt to protect him, could result in disaster, potentially endangering not only their investigation, but the very family Draven had only just begun to reclaim. As evening approached, Callum made his way toward Draven's study, carrying evidence that would soon transform quiet suspicion into concrete, actionable certainty. The pieces were finally coming together, and Callum understood, with growing unease, that the confrontation they had all been anticipating was rapidly approaching, carrying with it consequences that would reshape Blackthorn Pack for years to come. Draven listened in grim silence as Callum laid out everything he and Faye had uncovered, the requisition documents, the falsified training exercises, the testimony from Marcus confirming Victor's suspicious activity in the days before the attack. By the time his beta finished speaking, Draven's hands had clenched so tightly against the arms of his chair that his knuckles had turned white. Names, Draven said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that Callum recognized as far more concerning than open fury. You said Marcus provided names of others who assisted Victor. 3 individuals, Callum confirmed, sliding a small piece of paper across the desk. All of them advanced significantly within our pack structure over the following years. One serves currently as a senior warrior commander. Another oversees our southern trade relations. The third holds a position within our internal security division. Draven studied the names carefully, recognizing each one as individuals he had trusted, consulted, and relied upon throughout his years of leadership. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, spreading through his chest with each passing second as he considered the full scope of what this conspiracy might represent. They've been embedded within every level of our leadership structure for 20 years, Draven said slowly, disbelief and fury warring within his voice. Advising me, serving beside me, while carrying the knowledge of what they truly did to this pack, to Elena, to our entire community. We don't yet know their full level of involvement, Callum cautioned. It's possible some of them followed Victor's instructions without fully understanding the consequences, without realizing they were participating in something as devastating as what ultimately occurred that night. That distinction matters little to me right now, Draven said, rising from his desk and pacing the length of his study with barely contained energy. Whether through willing participation or willful ignorance, they contributed to an attack that nearly killed the woman I loved and forced my daughter to spend her entire childhood in hiding. Callum remained silent, allowing his alpha space to process the overwhelming weight of betrayal before continuing with the practical matters that still required careful attention. We need a plan, he said finally. Confronting Victor directly, without absolute proof of his central role, and without first neutralizing potential support from these other individuals, could allow him to escape justice entirely, or worse, could provoke a dangerous reaction that endangers Ren, Ivy, and possibly Elena herself, wherever she remains hidden. Draven stopped pacing, forcing himself to set aside raw emotion in favor of the strategic thinking that had guided him through 20 years of leadership. You're right, he said, though the admission clearly cost him considerable effort. We need certainty, and we need to ensure our family's safety before taking any action that might provoke desperate retaliation. I suggest we continue gathering evidence quietly for a few more days, Callum said. Meanwhile, I recommend increasing security around Ren and Ivy significantly, perhaps even relocating them to a more secure location within the territory, without publicly announcing the reason. Agreed, Draven said, and Elena. We need to locate her as well, ensure she receives protection immediately, rather than remaining vulnerable wherever Ren has hidden her all this time. The following morning, Draven requested another private meeting with Ren, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately alerted her to the significance of whatever he intended to discuss. He explained everything Callum had uncovered, watching her reaction carefully, as pieces of information she had long suspected finally received concrete confirmation. Victor Lang, Ren repeated slowly, her expression hardening with recognition. Elena mentioned that name once, years ago, though she was never certain of his full involvement. She remembered him visiting shortly before the attack, though she couldn't recall the specific reason for his presence at the time. "We need to bring Elena somewhere safe," Draven said, immediately. "If Victor discovers that we're investigating him, or if word somehow reaches him regarding Elena's survival, he may act desperately to eliminate any remaining threat to his position." Ren nodded slowly, understanding the urgency despite her lingering caution built through 20 years of careful protection. "I can send word to her," she said. "Though the journey will take several days, and I worry about the risk of movement itself, particularly if anyone within your pack remains loyal to Victor, and might notice unusual activity. Send someone you trust completely," Draven said. "Someone with no connection to our pack, someone Victor and his allies would have no reason to suspect or monitor." Ren considered this carefully before nodding. "I know someone," she said. "A friend who has helped us during difficult moments over the years. I will contact her immediately and arrange for Elena's safe transport here, though it will require patience and careful timing to avoid drawing unwanted attention." As their conversation concluded, Draven felt a mixture of relief and mounting anxiety, understanding that bringing Elena directly into potential danger carried significant risk, but recognizing equally that continued separation, given everything they now understood about the ongoing threat, offered no true safety either. Meanwhile, within his private study, Victor Lang had grown increasingly suspicious of the unusual activity surrounding him. Nolan had reported additional concerning developments: increased security around the guest quarters, private meetings between Draven and his beta that excluded the rest of the council entirely, and whispered conversations among warriors that suggested something significant was being carefully concealed from general pack knowledge. Victor summoned his old allies to a private meeting that evening, gathering the same individuals Marcus had identified to Callum earlier that day, though Victor remained unaware his carefully hidden network had already been exposed to Blackthorn's leadership. "Something is happening," Victor said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety, as his allies gathered within his private quarters, the door secured firmly behind them. "Beta Heart has been reviewing old records from 20 years ago. The Alpha has shown unusual interest in these newcomers, this woman and her daughter." "You believe they're connected to that night?" asked one of the assembled individuals, a senior warrior commander named Bree, her expression carrying visible unease at the implications of Victor's suspicion. "I believe it's possible," Victor admitted grimly. "And if it is, if Elena somehow survived and has finally revealed herself, everything we built over the past 20 years could collapse entirely." Silence settled heavily over the room as the gathered individuals absorbed the potential consequences of Victor's suspicion. Each of them had benefited significantly from the restructuring of pack leadership following the attack, advancing into positions of influence and authority they might never have achieved under different circumstances. "What do you propose we do?" asked another individual, a wolf named Grant who oversaw the pack's internal security division. Victor's expression hardened with cold determination, 20 years of carefully protected secrets weighing heavily upon his calculated decision. "We cannot allow this truth to surface," he said. "Whatever measures become necessary, we must ensure that whatever threat these newcomers represent is neutralized before it destroys everything we've worked to build." "You're suggesting we harm them," Bree said, her voice carrying visible discomfort at the implication. "A woman and a young girl, potentially the Alpha's own daughter." "I'm suggesting we protect ourselves," Victor corrected sharply. "Just as we protected our futures 20 years ago. This is no different, merely a continuation of decisions already made long before tonight." The room remained tense, several individuals exchanging uncertain glances, clearly troubled by the direction their conversation had taken. But 20 years of complicity, 20 years of benefiting from a secret too devastating to risk exposing, ultimately proved more compelling than whatever moral hesitation remained among them. "We need a plan," Grant said finally, his voice resigned, despite obvious discomfort. Something quiet, something that raises no immediate suspicion, especially given the increased security you've mentioned around the guest quarters. Victor nodded slowly, already formulating the beginnings of a strategy within his calculating mind. "Leave that to me," he said. "I still hold considerable influence within certain circles of this pack, influence that will prove useful in the days ahead." As the meeting concluded and his co-conspirators departed into the darkness, Victor remained alone within his study, staring out toward the guest quarters where Ren and Ivy remained unknowingly at the center of a conspiracy that had already claimed so much, and now threatened to claim considerably more before finally reaching its inevitable, dangerous conclusion. He had protected his secret for 20 years, through careful patience and calculated decisions. He was not prepared to allow it to unravel now, regardless of what desperate measures such protection might ultimately require. Unbeknownst to Victor, his private meeting had not gone entirely unnoticed. Bree, the senior warrior commander who had voiced quiet discomfort during their gathering, found herself unable to shake the unease that had settled over her since leaving Victor's quarters. She had spent 20 years believing, or perhaps simply convincing herself, that the decisions made that terrible night had been unavoidable, necessary sacrifices for the greater stability of their pack. But hearing Victor speak so casually about potentially harming a young girl, someone who might genuinely be the Alpha's own daughter, had cracked something within her that 2 decades of careful rationalization could no longer fully repair. She walked slowly through the quiet territory that night, her mind racing through the implications of what she had witnessed, torn between loyalty to the man who had elevated her career, and a growing horror at what continued loyalty might now require of her. Her path eventually led her, almost without conscious decision, toward the pack archives, where she knew Callum Hart had been spending considerable time in recent days. She found the building dark and locked for the evening, though a single light remained visible within, suggesting someone still worked inside despite the late hour. She knocked hesitantly, and after a long moment, Callum opened the door, his expression immediately shifting to surprise upon seeing her standing there, visible distress evident across her features. "Commander Bree," he said carefully. "This is an unexpected visit." "I need to speak with you," Bree said, her voice trembling slightly. "Privately and urgently. I believe I have information you need to hear, though sharing it may cost me everything I've built over the past 20 years. Callum studied her closely, recognizing the genuine distress in her expression, before stepping aside to allow her entry, closing the door firmly behind them. "Whatever you tell me," he said carefully, "will be treated with appropriate discretion, and I promise you protection should you require it." Bree took a shaky breath, 20 years of carefully maintained silence finally beginning to crumble beneath the weight of her conscience. "I was involved," she said quietly, tears forming in her eyes, "in the attack, 20 years ago. Victor recruited several of us, promising advancement and security, in exchange for our assistance, weakening our own defenses. I told myself for years that we had no real choice, that Victor's plan would have succeeded regardless of our participation. But tonight, hearing him discuss harming an innocent child to protect our secret, I realized I can no longer continue carrying this guilt in silence." Callum remained still, absorbing this unexpected confession with careful composure despite the significance of what she was revealing. "Tell me everything," he said gently, "from the beginning, and know that your willingness to come forward now will be considered carefully in whatever consequences ultimately follow." Bree nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks, as she began recounting details of Victor's original plan, the specific instructions he had given each of his co-conspirators, and the meeting that had just concluded, where Victor had made clear his intention to eliminate whatever threat Ren and Ivy represented to his carefully protected secret. As she spoke, Callum's expression grew increasingly grim, understanding that the danger surrounding Draven's newly reclaimed family was far more immediate and severe than he had previously realized. Victor was not merely a passive threat waiting to be discovered. He was actively planning action, and that action could occur at any moment, potentially before their own investigation had gathered sufficient evidence to move against him safely and effectively. "I need to bring this to the Alpha immediately," Callum said, rising quickly from his chair. "Your testimony, combined with everything else we've gathered, should provide sufficient grounds to act swiftly, before Victor has the opportunity to carry out whatever plan he has begun formulating." "What will happen to me?" Bree asked, her voice small and uncertain, despite her considerable rank and experience. "That will be the Alpha's decision," Callum said honestly. "But coming forward voluntarily, providing testimony that protects innocent lives, will certainly be considered favorably, compared to continued silence and complicity." Bree nodded, accepting this uncertain future with visible resignation, though relief was equally evident beneath her lingering anxiety, the relief of finally releasing a burden she had carried silently for far too long. Callum guided her quickly toward Draven's study, understanding that the information she carried demanded immediate attention, regardless of the late hour. As they walked through the darkened territory, he felt the weight of impending confrontation settling heavily over him, recognizing that whatever careful, patient investigation they had planned had suddenly accelerated into something far more urgent and dangerous. The traitor's plan was already in motion, and now, finally, Blackthorn Pack possessed the knowledge and testimony required to stop him, provided they moved quickly enough to prevent whatever desperate action Victor Lang intended to take against the family Draven had only just begun to reclaim. Draven rose from his desk the moment Callum entered with Bree, sensing immediately from their expressions that whatever news they carried demanded urgent attention. He listened in tense silence as Bree repeated her confession, her voice steadying gradually as she moved through the difficult details of Victor's original plan, his manipulation of ambitious younger warriors, and the devastating consequences that had followed 20 years ago. "He intends to act soon," Bree finished, her voice tight with remaining fear. He spoke of neutralizing the threat these newcomers represent, without specifying exactly how or when, but the urgency in his voice suggested he does not intend to wait long. Draven's expression had hardened into something dangerously calm throughout Bree's testimony, the controlled fury of a man who had spent 20 years disciplining himself against exactly this kind of overwhelming emotion. "You have my gratitude for coming forward," he said finally. "Though you understand there will be consequences for your involvement, even given your cooperation now." "I understand," Bree said quietly. "I only ask that whatever punishment I face, it comes after ensuring the girl and her mother remain safe from whatever Victor intends." "That is our priority," Draven confirmed. "Callum, I want Ren and Ivy moved immediately to the most secure location within our territory. Not the guest quarters, somewhere within the central compound, heavily guarded, with access limited only to those we trust absolutely." "I'll arrange it tonight," Callum said, already turning toward the door. "Wait," Draven said, stopping him. "We also need to consider Elena. If Ren has already sent word requesting her transport here, we need to intercept that message, and either accelerate protective measures or delay her arrival until we've neutralized this threat entirely." Callum nodded grimly, understanding the complexity of coordinating protection across multiple fronts simultaneously. "I'll speak with Ren immediately regarding Elena's location and current travel plans," he said. "We need accurate information before we can properly protect her." As Callum departed to arrange increased security, Draven turned back toward Bree, studying her carefully. "The other two individuals you mentioned," he said, "Grant and the warrior commander whose name you haven't yet shared. Do you believe they will follow through with whatever action Victor ultimately orders?" Bree hesitated before answering honestly. Grant seemed troubled, but committed to following Victor's lead, as he has been for 20 years. The third individual, a warrior named Owen Fairweather, expressed the most hesitation of anyone present, though I cannot be certain whether that hesitation will translate into refusal when the moment for action actually arrives. "I need you to help us," Draven said carefully. "Continue appearing loyal to Victor while providing information about his plans as they develop. I understand the danger this places you in, but it may prove essential to preventing whatever harm he intends." Bree considered this request for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I will do what I can," she said, "though I ask for protection should Victor discover my betrayal before we're able to stop him completely." "You have my word," Draven said firmly. "Whatever happens, you will be protected." As Bree departed to return to her normal duties, careful to avoid raising Victor's suspicion, Draven remained alone within his study, the weight of impending confrontation settling heavily over him. 20 years of patient grief had suddenly accelerated into urgent, dangerous action, and he understood that the coming days would determine not only the fate of his newly reclaimed family, but the future stability of his entire pack. Meanwhile, Callum found Ren still awake within the guest quarters, her expression immediately alert as he explained the urgent need to relocate her and Ivy to more secure accommodations within the central compound. Has something happened? Ren asked, fear evident despite her attempt to remain composed. We have credible information that Victor Lang intends to act against you and Ivy soon, Callum said honestly, understanding that Ren deserved full transparency given the danger involved. We need to move you immediately to somewhere more secure. Ren's face paled, though she nodded quickly, already moving to wake Ivy and gather their few belongings. What about Elena? She asked urgently. I sent word requesting her transport here just yesterday. If Victor discovers her location before we can protect her properly, she could be in immediate danger. Where is she? Callum asked. We need accurate information to arrange proper protection during her journey. Ren hesitated only briefly before answering, recognizing the necessity of full disclosure, given the escalating danger. She has been staying in a small settlement several days' journey to the east, hidden among a community of packless wolves who agreed to protect her identity in exchange for her assistance with their healing needs. She has grown skilled in herbal medicine over the years, skills that have earned her welcome and protection within that community. I'll dispatch trusted warriors immediately to escort her here safely, Callum said, discreetly, avoiding any route that might be monitored or compromised. As Ren finished gathering their belongings, Ivy emerged from her sleeping area, confusion and alarm evident as she absorbed the urgent atmosphere surrounding their sudden relocation. What's happening? She asked. Are we in danger? We need to move somewhere safer, Ren said gently, though her tension remained visible, despite her attempt to reassure her daughter. Just a precaution, but an important one, given everything we've recently learned. Ivy nodded, though her expression carried the weary understanding of someone who had experienced too many sudden, unexplained relocations throughout her life to feel genuine surprise at this development. She asked, At this new location? He will visit as often as possible, Callum assured her, offering a reassuring smile despite the seriousness of their situation. But for now, your safety remains the absolute priority. They moved quickly through the darkened territory, guided carefully by trusted warriors who understood the sensitivity of their mission, eventually reaching a secure section of the central compound reserved typically for high-ranking pack members requiring additional protection. The accommodations were comfortable, though considerably more heavily guarded than the guest quarters they had previously occupied. As dawn approached, Draven arrived to check on their safety personally, finding Ivy still awake despite the late hour, sitting near a window and staring out at the territory beyond, with an expression of thoughtful contemplation. You should be resting, Draven said gently, settling into a chair nearby. I keep thinking about everything, Ivy admitted, about my mother, about the danger surrounding us, about how strange it feels knowing my entire life has been shaped by decisions made before I was even born. I understand, Draven said, though I promise you, whatever danger currently threatens us, we will overcome it, and soon, you will finally meet Elena, and our family will begin healing from 20 years of unnecessary separation. Ivy studied him carefully, something vulnerable and hopeful crossing her features despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes. I've spent my whole life wondering what it would feel like to have a real family, she said quietly. Not just my mother and me constantly running, but something stable, something permanent. You have that now, Draven said firmly. Regardless of whatever challenges we face in the coming days, I promise you, Ivy, you will never again have to wonder about your family or your place within it. As their conversation continued softly through the early morning hours, elsewhere within the territory, warriors dispatched by Callum began their careful journey eastward, tasked with retrieving Elena and ensuring her safe passage back to Blackthorn before Victor Lang's desperate plans could reach fruition. Meanwhile, within his own quarters, Victor grew increasingly agitated as reports reached him regarding the sudden, unexplained relocation of Ren and Ivy to more secure accommodations within the central compound. Something had clearly shifted, some development he had not yet identified, and the increased security surrounding them suggested his suspicions regarding their significance had somehow been confirmed by Draven's leadership. He summoned Grant immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety, as his co-conspirator arrived. They've moved the girl and her mother, Victor said, somewhere more secure, more heavily guarded. This suggests our activities have not gone unnoticed as thoroughly as we hoped. Grant's expression tightened with visible unease. What do you propose we do? He asked. We accelerate our timeline, Victor said grimly. Whatever action we intended to take, gradually, carefully, we now need to execute swiftly, before Draven has the opportunity to gather sufficient evidence against us, or implement protections we cannot overcome. That's incredibly risky, Grant said carefully. Acting hastily, without proper planning, significantly increases our chances of failure and potential exposure. Continued inaction carries equal risk, Victor countered sharply. If Draven already suspects our involvement, delay only provides him additional time to solidify evidence and protection. We must act now, while we still retain sufficient influence and resources to succeed. Grant reluctantly agreed, though his expression remained troubled as Victor began outlining a more immediate, aggressive plan, one that would require decisive action within the coming days, rather than the careful, gradual approach they had originally discussed. As the sun rose fully over Blackthorn territory that morning, two opposing forces prepared themselves for confrontation. Neither side could delay much longer. Draven's warriors traveled eastward, racing against time, to secure Elena's safety, before Victor's desperation could locate and threaten her. Meanwhile, within his own compromised position, Victor Lang finalized plans born from 20 years of carefully protected secrecy, now rapidly unraveling beyond his control. The peace that had settled tentatively over Blackthorn, following Ivy's emotional reunion with her father, was about to be shattered entirely, replaced by a confrontation that would finally determine whether justice, so long delayed, could still be achieved, or whether Victor's desperate final actions would claim yet more devastating losses before the truth could fully emerge into the light. Far to the east, within the quiet settlement Wren had described, Elena knelt beside a small garden of healing herbs, her hands moving with practiced familiarity through work that had become both livelihood and quiet therapy during the long years of hiding. She had grown thinner over the decades, her once vibrant energy tempered by exhaustion and the constant weight of fear that had never fully released its grip upon her, even within this relatively peaceful community that had welcomed her without questions 20 years ago. She looked up as a young messenger approached, someone she recognized as connected to the network of trusted contacts Wren had carefully maintained throughout their years of separation. Her heart immediately quickened with anxious anticipation, understanding that unexpected messages rarely carried good news given the careful precautions they had always maintained. A letter, the messenger said, extending a sealed envelope. From Wren. She said it was urgent. Elena's hands trembled as she opened the letter, her eyes scanning quickly through Wren's careful handwriting, absorbing information that struck her with overwhelming force. Ivy had reached Blackthorn safely. Draven had discovered the truth, and now, after 20 years of separation, Wren was requesting that Elena finally return, finally reunite with the daughter and mate she had sacrificed so much to protect from a distance. Tears filled her eyes as she read the letter a second time, joy and terror mingling within her chest in equal measure. 20 years of careful hiding, 20 years of watching from a distance through Wren's occasional reports, 20 years of longing for a reunion she had never fully allowed herself to believe might actually occur. But the letter also carried warning, mentioning briefly the ongoing dangers surrounding their situation, the possibility that whoever had orchestrated the original attack might still pose a threat even now, 2 decades later. Elena's joy tempered immediately with renewed fear, old instincts honed through years of careful survival, immediately activating, despite her desperate longing to finally return home. She sought out the settlement's elder, an aging wolf named Priya, who had welcomed her into their community without question all those years ago, explaining briefly that circumstances now required her departure, though she remained careful about revealing too many specific details even now. "You've waited a long time for this moment," Priya observed gently, studying Elena's conflicted expression with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed her quiet grief unfold gradually over 2 decades of careful friendship, "though I sense you remain frightened despite your obvious joy." "I am," Elena admitted honestly. "The danger that forced me into hiding may still exist. I fear returning might place everyone I love in renewed jeopardy, rather than finally providing the safety and reunion I've longed for." "Sometimes," Priya said thoughtfully, "continued hiding provides only the illusion of safety, while true courage requires facing danger directly, especially when the alternative means permanent separation from those we love most. Elena nodded slowly, recognizing wisdom in Priya's words despite her lingering fear. She spent that evening preparing carefully for her journey, gathering the few possessions she had accumulated during her years within the settlement, saying quiet farewells to the community that had provided unexpected refuge during the most difficult period of her life. 3 days later, as she traveled westward toward Blackthorn territory, alongside a small group of warriors Draven had dispatched for her protection, Elena felt a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread building steadily within her chest. Every mile brought her closer to the daughter she had sacrificed so much to protect, and the mate she had loved desperately despite 20 years of enforced separation. But every mile also brought her closer to whatever danger continued lurking within Blackthorn's own walls, danger that had already cost her 20 years of stolen time, and continued threatening the fragile reunion she had waited so long to finally experience. The warriors escorting her remained vigilant throughout the journey, alert to any sign of pursuit or ambush, though the roads remained quiet and uneventful as they made steady progress toward Blackthorn territory. Elena found herself studying these unfamiliar warriors carefully, searching their expressions for any hint of familiarity with the pack she had once called home, though 20 years had changed the faces of Blackthorn's forces considerably since she had last walked among them. As evening fell on the third day of travel, with Blackthorn territory now less than a day's journey ahead, one of the escorting warriors approached her quietly, his expression carrying visible unease. "Lady Elena," he said carefully, using a title she had not heard applied to herself in 20 years. "We've received word from Beta Hart. There have been developments within the pack that require additional caution during our final approach." "What kind of developments?" Elena asked, old fear immediately resurfacing despite her attempts to remain calm. "I don't have full details," the warrior admitted honestly, "only instructions to remain especially vigilant and to avoid the main roads during our final approach, taking a more discreet route through the eastern forests instead." Elena nodded slowly, understanding immediately that whatever danger Ren's letter had mentioned remained very much active, requiring continued caution even now, so close to the reunion she had waited 2 decades to finally experience. She drew her cloak more tightly around herself, steeling her resolve for whatever challenges remained ahead, determined that after 20 years of sacrifice and separation, nothing would prevent her from finally reclaiming the family she loved so deeply. As their small group altered course, moving carefully through the dense eastern forests under the cover of gathering darkness, none of them yet realized that Victor Lang's desperate plans had already begun accelerating far beyond simple surveillance, moving rapidly toward the dangerous confrontation that would soon determine the fate of everyone connected to Blackthorn's long-buried secret. Bree returned to Victor's inner circle the following day, maintaining careful composure despite the weight of her secret betrayal now working actively against him. She found Victor pacing restlessly within his study, his usual calm, calculating demeanor replaced by visible agitation that suggested his careful control over the situation had begun slipping considerably. "You wanted to see me," Bree said carefully, closing the door behind her. "We're moving forward tonight," Victor said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "I've learned that additional warriors were dispatched eastward several days ago, likely to retrieve Elena. If she arrives within Blackthorn territory, our window for addressing this situation quietly closes entirely." Bree's stomach tightened with dread, understanding that whatever plan Victor had finalized would soon require action she needed to report immediately to Callum, if they hoped to prevent devastating consequences. "What exactly do you intend to do?" she asked carefully. "Grant has arranged access to the central compound where they've relocated the girl and her mother," Victor said. "Tonight, while security remains focused on external threats, we'll move against them directly, ensuring this threat to our position is permanently neutralized before Elena's potential arrival complicates matters further." "And if we're caught?" Bree asked, struggling to maintain her composed exterior, despite the horror building within her at Victor's casual discussion of harming an innocent girl. "We won't be," Victor said with cold certainty. "Grant has ensured the guards on duty tonight belong to our trusted network. We'll have sufficient opportunity to act without interference, provided everyone maintains discipline and executes their assigned roles precisely." Bree nodded, forcing herself to appear compliant, despite the revulsion building within her chest. As soon as she could reasonably excuse herself from Victor's presence, she moved quickly through the territory, seeking out Callum, with information that could no longer wait for careful, gradual confirmation. She found him within the central compound, personally overseeing security arrangements for Ren and Ivy's protection. Her urgent expression immediately alerted him to the severity of whatever news she carried. "Victor plans to act tonight," Bree said quietly, once they had moved to a private location away from other pack members. "He believes Grant has compromised the guards scheduled for tonight's shift within the central compound. They intend to move against Ivy and Ren directly, hoping to eliminate the threat before Elena's arrival." Callum's expression hardened immediately, understanding the urgent necessity of swift, decisive action. "Which guards specifically?" he asked. "We need to identify and replace anyone potentially compromised before tonight's shift begins." Bree provided the names she had learned, warriors who had apparently been quietly cultivated by Grant over recent years, individuals whose loyalty to Victor's network ran deeper than their official duty to the pack's broader leadership structure. "I need to inform Draven immediately," Callum said. "We'll need to arrange proper security, using warriors whose loyalty is beyond question, while allowing Victor to believe his plan remains undetected, so we can catch him and his co-conspirators in the act, rather than simply preventing tonight's attempt and allowing them another opportunity later." "That's incredibly risky," Bree said, concern evident in her voice. "If something goes wrong, if the compromised guards realize the plan has been discovered too early, Ivy and Ren's safety could be jeopardized, regardless of our preparation." "I understand the risk," Callum said grimly. "But if we simply prevent tonight's attempt without exposing Victor definitively, he'll likely try again, perhaps more carefully, perhaps in a manner we cannot anticipate or prevent as effectively. We need this confrontation to happen under conditions we control completely." They moved quickly toward Draven's study, where Callum relayed Bree's information with urgent precision. Draven listened with barely controlled fury, understanding immediately the gravity of the threat now facing his daughter and Ren, the woman who had protected her so faithfully throughout 20 years of hiding. "We replace the compromised guards with warriors we trust absolutely," Draven said, his voice carrying dangerous calm, despite the fury evident beneath his controlled exterior. "But we allow Victor and his allies to believe their plan remains viable. Tonight, when they attempt to act, we'll be waiting, and this conspiracy will finally be exposed before the entire pack." Callum nodded, already moving to implement the necessary preparations, carefully selecting warriors whose loyalty remained beyond question, while ensuring the compromised guards Bree had identified remained unaware their positions had been quietly reassigned to trusted replacements, disguised within the normal shift rotation. As evening approached, tension built steadily throughout the central compound, though only a select few understood the true significance of the night ahead. Ivy remained largely unaware of the specific danger unfolding around her, though she sensed the unusual seriousness in her father's expression when he visited briefly that evening, his protective instincts clearly heightened beyond his usual careful composure. "Is something wrong?" Ivy asked, noticing the tension radiating from Draven despite his attempts to appear calm during their brief conversation. "Simply additional precautions," Draven said, unwilling to alarm her unnecessarily given the careful trap they had prepared. "I want you to remain within your quarters tonight, Ivy, regardless of anything you might hear or notice. Can you promise me that?" Ivy studied him carefully, sensing more significance behind his request than his careful words suggested. "You're worried about something specific," she said, "something dangerous." "I promise you," Draven said gently. "By morning, everything will be considerably safer than it is right now. But tonight, I need you to trust me completely and remain exactly where you are." Ivy nodded slowly, though anxiety clearly lingered despite her father's reassurance. Ren, standing nearby, exchanged a knowing glance with Draven, understanding the gravity of what approached even without full details being shared explicitly in front of Ivy. As night fully settled over Blackthorn territory, warriors positioned themselves carefully throughout the central compound, disguised within their normal patrol routines, while remaining alert for any sign of Victor's planned intrusion. Draven remained close by, personally overseeing preparations, despite Callum's gentle suggestion that his direct involvement might prove unnecessary, given the careful arrangements already in place. "I need to be here," Draven said firmly, This concerns my daughter directly. I will not remain distant while her safety hangs in the balance. Callum did not argue further, understanding the impossible position his alpha found himself in. Torn between strategic caution and fierce paternal protection, he had waited 20 years to finally express. As the hours passed slowly, tension building steadily with each passing moment, movement was finally detected near the compound's eastern entrance, figures moving carefully through the shadows with the practiced stealth of individuals accustomed to operating covertly. Callum signaled quietly to the surrounding warriors, confirming that their carefully laid trap was finally about to be sprung. Victor Lang moved among the shadows himself, accompanied by Grant and several additional warriors loyal to their conspiracy, his expression carrying the cold determination of a man committed fully to protecting a secret he had guarded for 20 desperate years. He gave quiet signals to his companions, directing them carefully toward the guest quarters, where he believed Ivy and Wren remained vulnerably positioned, unaware that Blackthorn's leadership had already anticipated and prepared for exactly this moment. As Victor's group approached the entrance to what they believed remained lightly guarded quarters, Draven stepped forward from the shadows, his expression carrying 20 years of accumulated betrayal finally reaching its breaking point. "Victor," Draven said, his voice cutting through the darkness with dangerous authority. "I believe we have considerable matters to discuss." Victor froze immediately, his expression shifting rapidly from confident determination to stunned horror as he realized, with devastating clarity, that his carefully planned attack had walked directly into a trap prepared specifically to expose him. "Alpha Cross," Victor said, attempting unsuccessfully to maintain his usual composed demeanor, despite the obvious panic building rapidly beneath his surface. This is not what it appears to be." "Is it not?" Draven said coldly, stepping fully into view as surrounding warriors emerged from their concealed positions, effectively surrounding Victor and his co-conspirators before they could attempt any escape. "Because it appears to me that you and your allies have arrived here tonight intending harm against my daughter and the woman who protected her throughout 20 years of hiding, exactly as you once orchestrated harm against her mother during the attack that nearly claimed all our lives 20 years ago." Victor's expression collapsed entirely, 20 years of carefully maintained secrecy finally crumbling beneath the undeniable weight of exposure. Beside him, Grant and the remaining conspirators exchanged panicked glances, understanding immediately that their carefully planned attack had failed catastrophically, exposing not just tonight's intended harm, but the entire conspiracy stretching back 2 devastating decades. "You don't understand," Victor said desperately, his careful composure abandoned entirely in favor of raw, panicked justification. "Everything I did for this pack's stability, for its future strength, Elena's survival, her daughter's existence. These things threaten everything I sacrificed to build." "You sacrificed nothing," Draven said, his voice trembling with 20 years of restrained fury finally breaking free. "You stole everything from me, from my daughter, from the woman I loved. 20 years of grief, 20 years of separation, all because of your ambition and betrayal." As Draven's warriors moved to secure Victor and his remaining allies, the truth Blackthorn Pack had unknowingly harbored for 20 long years finally emerged fully into the light, though the confrontation that had exposed this devastating betrayal was far from complete, and the consequences of tonight's failed attack would soon reverberate throughout the entire pack in ways none of them could yet fully anticipate. Grant, sensing the complete collapse of their plan, attempted a desperate move toward the tree line, hoping to escape into the darkness before Blackthorn's warriors could fully secure the area. 2 warriors intercepted him quickly, restraining him firmly despite his struggling protests, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by frantic desperation. "Let me go," Grant demanded, though his voice carried the hollow panic of someone who understood his situation had become hopeless. "I only followed instructions. Victor planned everything. I simply assisted." "That distinction will be considered carefully during formal proceedings," Callum said firmly, stepping forward to oversee the remaining conspirators' restraint. "For now, you will all remain in custody while we determine the full extent of tonight's conspiracy and the events of 20 years ago that led us to this moment." Victor remained standing rigidly, defeat evident across his features, despite his attempt to maintain some semblance of dignity even now. 20 years, he said quietly, almost to himself. 20 years of careful planning, unraveled in a single night. 20 years of stolen time, Draven corrected sharply. Time I should have spent raising my daughter, loving my mate, building the family that was rightfully mine, before your ambition destroyed everything. Inside the nearby guest quarters, Ivy had heard the commotion despite her father's earlier instruction to remain inside, regardless of what she might notice. She moved cautiously toward the window, her heart pounding as she witnessed warriors moving through the darkness, restraining several individuals she did not recognize. Ren appeared beside her quickly, gently guiding her away from the window despite Ivy's obvious desire to understand what was happening. "Stay back," Ren said softly. "Your father promised everything would be safer by morning. Let him handle this." "But what if something happens to him?" Ivy asked, fear evident in her voice despite her attempt to remain calm. "Your father has led this pack successfully for 20 years, Ren said reassuringly, though her own concern remained visible beneath her careful composure. "He knows exactly what he's doing tonight." Outside, as the remaining conspirators were secured and prepared for transport toward the pack's secure holding facility, Draven approached Victor directly, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of fury, exhaustion, and finally, some measure of long-awaited closure. "Why?" Draven asked quietly, needing to understand, even now, what had driven Victor toward such devastating betrayal 20 years earlier. "You held respect, influence, a comfortable position within our pack even before that night. What could possibly have justified what you did?" Victor's expression carried genuine bitterness as he answered, years of suppressed resentment finally surfacing despite his current circumstances. "I spent decades in your father's shadow, then yours, always capable, always loyal, yet never fully trusted with the influence I knew I deserved. The attack presented opportunity, Alpha Cross, opportunity to finally claim the position and respect I had earned through years of overlooked service." "You claimed that position through betrayal and violence," Draven said coldly. "Through nearly costing my mate her life, through denying my daughter 20 years with her family. Whatever resentment you carried does not justify the devastation you caused." Victor said nothing further, understanding perhaps for the first time the full weight of consequences his ambition had ultimately created. As warriors led him away toward secure confinement, Draven remained standing within the quiet darkness, watching the aftermath of a confrontation 20 years in the making finally reach its conclusion. Callum approached quietly, his own expression carrying visible relief, despite the seriousness of the night's events. "It's done," he said. "Victor and his allies are secured. We'll need to conduct thorough investigation and formal proceedings in the coming days, but the immediate danger has been neutralized." "Thank you," Draven said sincerely, turning to face his loyal beta. "For everything you've done throughout this entire investigation. Without your diligence, we might never have uncovered this truth at all. You would have done the same for me," Callum said simply. "Now, I believe there's a daughter waiting anxiously to know her father remains safe." Draven nodded, exhaustion and relief finally beginning to overcome the tense adrenaline that had sustained him throughout the night's confrontation. He made his way toward the guest quarters, finding Ivy still awake, worry evident across her features despite Ren's attempts to reassure her throughout the tense hours of waiting. "Father," Ivy said, relief flooding her expression the moment she saw him standing safely in the doorway. "You're all right." "I'm all right," Draven confirmed, moving quickly to embrace her, a gesture that still felt new and precious, given how recently they had discovered their true connection. "The danger has been addressed, Ivy. Tonight, the truth about what happened 20 years ago was finally fully exposed." Ivy pulled back slightly, studying his expression carefully. "Is it truly over?" she asked. "Are we finally safe?" Draven hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "The immediate threat has been neutralized," he said, "though there remains work ahead, ensuring justice is properly served and understanding the full extent of what occurred. But yes, Ivy, I believe we are finally, truly safe." As dawn approached, casting soft golden light across Blackthorn territory, the pack began absorbing the shocking revelation that would soon spread throughout their entire community. The exposure of a betrayal 20 years in the making, finally brought to justice through careful investigation and courageous testimony. But even amid this hard-won resolution, One final piece of their story remained unresolved: the reunion between Draven and Elena that had been delayed by circumstance, danger, and 20 devastating years of separation. A reunion that would soon arrive, bringing with it the final, healing conclusion this fractured family had waited so desperately long to finally experience. While Blackthorn celebrated the exposure of Victor's 20-year conspiracy, danger continued unfolding many miles away, where Elena and her small escort of warriors traveled carefully through the eastern forests, unaware that Victor's plan had already collapsed entirely back within the Pack's territory. Word of his capture had not yet reached them, and the warriors accompanying Elena remained cautious, following their original instructions to avoid main roads and maintain heightened vigilance throughout their journey. As their group moved through a particularly dense section of forest, one of the warriors suddenly halted, raising his hand sharply to signal caution. "Movement," he said quietly. "To our left, within the trees." Elena's heart quickened immediately, old instincts honed through 20 years of careful survival, activating despite her exhaustion from days of continuous travel. "How many?" she asked softly. "Difficult to determine," the warrior replied, his eyes scanning the darkness carefully. "Several, possibly more concealed further within the tree line." What none of them yet understood was that these approaching figures were not connected to Victor's conspiracy at all, but rather members of a smaller rival group, opportunistic wolves, who had learned through overheard rumors that a valuable target traveled through this territory, though they possessed only fragmented, inaccurate information regarding Elena's true identity and significance. The group's leader, a rough-looking wolf named Silas, had been tracking their party for several hours, drawn by whispered rumors circulating among less reputable circles that someone connected to Blackthorn's Alpha traveled through these forests with minimal protection, someone whose safe return might command significant ransom, given the obvious care being taken to protect her journey. "Ready yourselves," the lead warrior escorting Elena said quietly, positioning his companions defensively around her. "Whatever their intentions, we do not yield ground easily." The confrontation that followed unfolded swiftly within the darkened forest, Elena's escorts moving with practiced coordination to shield her while addressing the unexpected threat. Silas and his companions, though numerous, quickly discovered that Blackthorn's warriors possessed considerably more skill and discipline than they had anticipated, their careful formation holding firm despite the chaotic pressure of the ambush. Elena remained low, following her escort's urgent instructions to seek shelter behind a fallen tree while the confrontation played out around her, her mind racing through possibilities even as fear gripped her tightly. 20 years of careful hiding, and now, so close to finally reuniting with her family, danger had found her once again. The skirmish proved brief, Blackthorn's superior training ultimately overwhelming Silas's opportunistic group, who quickly recognized the futility of continued confrontation and retreated into the darkness, rather than risk further losses for a target whose value had proven far less certain than anticipated. As the immediate danger passed, Elena's lead escort helped her carefully back onto the path, his expression grim despite their successful defense. "Are you injured?" he asked urgently. "I'm all right," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly with residual adrenaline. "Thank you, all of you, for your protection. We should move quickly," the warrior said. "This encounter, though resolved successfully, suggests we should reach Blackthorn territory as swiftly as possible, rather than risk further complications during additional delay." They pressed forward through the remainder of the night, exhaustion weighing heavily upon the entire group despite their urgency, until finally, as dawn began breaking gently across the horizon, the familiar boundaries of Blackthorn territory came into view ahead of them. Elena felt her breath catch as recognition swept through her. 20 years having passed since she last stood upon this ground, yet the landscape remained achingly familiar despite the passage of time. Tears filled her eyes as she absorbed the sight of home, a home she had been forced to abandon under such devastating circumstances so many years before. Word of their approach reached the central compound quickly, warriors positioned along the border immediately recognizing the returning escort party and sending urgent notification ahead toward Draven's study, where he remained engaged in the difficult work of processing testimony from Victor and his captured co-conspirators following the previous night's confrontation. "Alpha," a young messenger said breathlessly, bursting into the study without the usual formal announcement. Elena has arrived at our northern border. She's safe, though her escort reports an encounter with hostile wolves during their journey. Draven rose immediately, every other consideration momentarily forgotten in the face of this long-awaited news. "Take me to her," he said, his voice carrying urgency he made no attempt to disguise. He moved quickly through the territory, his heart pounding with a complicated mixture of overwhelming anticipation and lingering disbelief that this moment, imagined countless times throughout 20 years of grief, was finally, truly, about to occur. As he approached the northern border, he saw her standing among the returning warriors, thinner than he remembered, her face carrying visible marks of exhaustion and the accumulated weight of 2 decades spent in hiding, yet unmistakably, achingly familiar, despite everything time and circumstance had changed. Elena saw him approaching and froze completely, 20 years of imagined reunions colliding suddenly with overwhelming reality. Neither of them moved for several long moments, simply staring at each other across the remaining distance, the weight of everything lost and everything about to be reclaimed hanging heavily in the space between them. "Elena," Draven finally managed, his voice breaking with emotion he had suppressed for 20 devastating years. "Draven," she whispered, tears streaming freely down her face as she finally moved toward him, closing the distance that had separated them for 2 decades of stolen time. They embraced with the desperate intensity of 2 people who had each believed, at various points throughout their separation, that this reunion might never actually occur. Draven held her tightly, memorizing the reality of her presence after so many years spent clinging only to memory and faded photographs, while Elena buried her face against him, finally allowing herself to release 20 years of carefully controlled fear and grief. "I thought I had lost you forever," Draven said, his voice thick with emotion, as he pulled back slightly to study her face, searching for every detail time had changed, while remaining fundamentally unable to accept she was truly, finally standing before him again. "I never stopped loving you," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Not for a single day, throughout everything. I only wanted to keep you and Ivy safe, even if that meant sacrificing everything we might have shared together." "Ivy," Draven said, sudden urgency returning to his expression. "She's here, Elena. She's safe, and she has been asking about you constantly since learning the truth." Elena's breath caught sharply, 20 years of longing for this exact moment finally within reach. "Take me to her," she said, her voice trembling with overwhelming anticipation. "Please, Draven, I cannot wait a moment longer." They moved together quickly through the territory, Draven's arm remaining protectively around Elena as they made their way toward the central compound, where Ivy waited, unaware that her mother's arrival was finally, truly happening. Word had already reached Ren, who quickly informed Ivy that her mother had arrived safely, watching with tearful joy as the girl's expression transformed instantly from cautious hope into overwhelming anticipation. Ivy rushed toward the compound entrance, her heart pounding with 19 years of accumulated longing for a mother she had never truly known, only to see, walking toward her across the open courtyard, a woman whose features mirrored her own so closely that recognition struck with immediate, undeniable certainty. "Mother," Ivy said, the word feeling both foreign and perfectly natural upon her lips. Elena stopped abruptly, overwhelming emotion overtaking her completely, as she finally beheld her daughter, grown into a young woman she had only imagined throughout years of forced separation. "Ivy," she breathed, tears flowing freely as she closed the remaining distance between them. "My daughter, my beautiful daughter." They embraced tightly, mother and daughter finally reunited after 19 years of separation, both crying freely as they held each other, surrounded by pack members who watched the emotional reunion with their own tears of joy and relief. Draven stood nearby, watching his family finally reunite completely, 20 years of grief and separation, giving way finally to the healing joy he had waited so desperately long to experience. "I'm so sorry," Elena said through her tears, holding Ivy's face gently between her hands, studying every feature with overwhelming love and longing. "I'm sorry for every year I couldn't be there, every moment I missed, every question I couldn't answer directly." "You protected me," Ivy said, her own tears flowing freely, despite her attempt to speak clearly. "You sacrificed everything to keep me safe. I understand that now, even if it took time to fully accept." Ren stood nearby, watching the emotional reunion unfold with her own tears of relief and joy. 20 years of carefully guarded promise, finally reaching its intended, healing conclusion. Elena noticed her old friend and immediately reached for her as well, pulling Ren into their embrace with fierce gratitude. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything you sacrificed, everything you risked, throughout every single one of these 20 years. I could never have kept Ivy safe without your unwavering protection and friendship." "You never needed to thank me," Ren said, her own tears flowing freely. "Ivy became like a daughter to me as well throughout these years. Protecting her was never a burden, simply an honor I was grateful to fulfill." As the emotional reunion continued within the courtyard, word spread quickly throughout Blackthorn territory regarding Elena's miraculous return, pack members gathering gradually to witness the healing conclusion of a tragedy that had shaped their community for 2 devastating decades. Grace, the elder council member who had first noticed the resemblance between Ivy and Elena, approached with tears of her own joy, embracing Elena warmly, despite the 20 years that had passed since their last meeting. "Welcome home," Grace said simply, though the weight of those 2 words carried immeasurable significance, given everything that had occurred to make this reunion finally possible. Draven finally moved forward, joining his family within their emotional embrace, 20 years of grief and separation, finally giving way completely to the reunion he had never fully allowed himself to believe might actually occur. He held Elena and Ivy together, his heart overwhelmed with a joy so profound it nearly matched the depth of grief he had carried throughout the previous 2 decades. "We're finally together," he said softly, his voice carrying 20 years of longing finally satisfied. "After everything, we're finally, truly together." As the courtyard filled with pack members celebrating this miraculous, long-awaited reunion, none of them yet fully understood that this joyful moment marked not simply the resolution of one family's devastating separation, but the beginning of Blackthorn Pack's healing from 20 years of hidden betrayal, a healing process that would require considerable work in the days ahead, but which had finally, truly, begun with this powerful, emotional reunion beneath the warm morning sun. That afternoon, once the initial overwhelming joy of reunion had settled into something calmer and more sustainable, Draven called an emergency council session, gathering the pack's senior leadership to address both Elena's miraculous return and the devastating conspiracy that had finally been exposed after 20 long years of careful concealment. The great hall filled quickly with council members and senior warriors, murmurs of shock and disbelief rippling through the assembled crowd as Draven began explaining, with careful clarity, the full scope of what had occurred both 20 years earlier and throughout the tense days leading to Victor's capture the previous night. 20 years ago, Draven said, his voice carrying steady authority despite the emotional weight of the topic, our pack suffered what we believed was a devastating but unavoidable tragedy. Last night, we learned the truth. That attack was not simply misfortune, but deliberate betrayal, orchestrated by someone we trusted deeply, someone who held significant influence within our own leadership structure. Gasps and murmurs spread through the assembled crowd as Draven continued detailing Victor's role, the evidence Callum and Faye had carefully gathered, and Bree's courageous testimony that had ultimately exposed the conspiracy before further harm could occur. Grace stood near the front of the gathering, her expression carrying solemn confirmation of everything Draven shared, having witnessed much of the investigation's progression firsthand. "What happens now?" one of the assembled elders asked, voicing the question clearly weighing on everyone present. "To Victor, and to those who assisted him?" "Formal proceedings will begin immediately," Draven said firmly. "Victor and his co-conspirators will face judgment, according to our pack's laws, with full consideration given to the severity of their betrayal and the 20 years of suffering it caused, both to my family directly and to our pack's broader stability and trust." He paused, allowing the weight of this announcement to settle, before continuing with the second, considerably more joyful portion of his address. "But today also brings healing alongside this difficult reckoning," he said, his voice softening with visible emotion. 20 years ago, we believed we lost Elena forever. Today, she has returned to us, alive, and I am proud to introduce our daughter, Ivy, who has finally been reunited with her true family after 19 years of circumstances that forced her mother into hiding for her protection. The hall erupted into a complicated mixture of continued shock and overwhelming joy as Elena and Ivy stepped forward, standing beside Draven as the assembled pack absorbed this remarkable, healing news. Applause and tearful expressions of welcome spread quickly throughout the gathering, pack members eager to embrace this joyful resolution following the difficult revelation of Victor's devastating betrayal. As the council session concluded, and pack members began dispersing to process the overwhelming developments of the past day, Draven remained standing with his family, watching as various pack members approached to offer congratulations, welcome, and quiet expressions of relief regarding justice finally being served after 20 years of unknowing grief. Bree approached cautiously, uncertain of her reception given her own complicated role within the conspiracy despite her ultimately courageous decision to come forward. Draven noticed her hesitation and moved deliberately to address her directly, understanding the importance of publicly acknowledging her contribution despite her earlier complicity. "Commander Bree," he said, loud enough for nearby pack members to hear clearly. "Your courage in coming forward, despite the personal risk involved, played an essential role in preventing further harm and finally exposing this 20-year conspiracy. That courage will be considered carefully and favorably during your own formal proceedings." Bree nodded gratefully, visible relief evident despite the uncertainty that still remained regarding her ultimate fate within the pack's justice system. "Thank you, Alpha," she said quietly. "I only wish I had found that courage 20 years sooner, before so much suffering occurred." "What matters now," Draven said gently, "is that you chose courage when it mattered most, protecting my daughter and preventing further tragedy. That choice will not be forgotten." As evening settled over Blackthorn territory, bringing to a close a day that had irrevocably transformed the pack's understanding of its own recent history, Draven finally found a quiet moment alone with Elena and Ivy, away from the overwhelming attention and celebration that had consumed their reunion throughout the afternoon. They sat together within Draven's private garden, the same garden where he had spent countless lonely evenings throughout 20 years of grief, now finally filled with the family he had never stopped hoping to reclaim. Elena leaned against him, exhaustion from her journey finally catching up with the overwhelming emotion of the day, while Ivy sat nearby, studying her parents together for the very first time, with quiet, contented wonder. "I still can hardly believe this is real," Elena admitted softly, her voice carrying 20 years of accumulated disbelief, finally giving way to acceptance. "After so many years imagining this moment, having it actually occur feels almost impossible to fully comprehend." "I understand completely," Draven said, holding her closely. "But it is real, Elena. You're here. Ivy is here. And after everything we've endured, our family is finally, truly together again." As darkness settled fully over the territory, stars beginning to emerge across the clear evening sky, the small family remained together within the quiet garden, beginning the long healing process of reclaiming 20 years of stolen time, while beyond the garden walls, Blackthorn Pack continued absorbing the remarkable events that had transformed their community from tragedy into hard-won, healing triumph. In the days that followed Elena's return, Blackthorn territory settled gradually into a new rhythm, one that balanced the difficult work of formal justice proceedings against Victor and his co-conspirators, alongside the joyful, ongoing process of a family finally learning to live together after 20 years of forced separation. The formal hearing convened within the Great Hall, exactly 1 week after Victor's capture. The entire Pack Council assembled to witness proceedings that would determine consequences for a betrayal spanning 2 devastating decades. Victor stood before the assembled council with none of his former confidence, 20 years of carefully maintained composure having crumbled entirely in the days since his exposure. "You stand accused," Grace said formally, serving as the council's appointed voice for the proceedings, "of orchestrating an attack against our own pack 20 years ago. An attack that resulted in significant loss of life, the near death of Elena Cross, and 20 years of forced separation for our Alpha's family. Additionally, you stand accused of conspiring, just 1 week ago, to cause further harm against Elena's daughter and the woman who protected her throughout those 20 years. Victor offered no denial, understanding the futility of continued deception, given the overwhelming evidence Callum and Faye had carefully gathered, combined with Bree's detailed testimony and confirmation from the other captured conspirators, several of whom had chosen, in the days following their capture, to cooperate fully with proceedings, in hopes of receiving more lenient consequences. "I accept responsibility," Victor said finally, his voice carrying none of its former calculated confidence. "For everything I orchestrated, 20 years ago and more recently. I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I acknowledge it fully." The council deliberated carefully over the following days, weighing the severity of Victor's 20-year betrayal against pack laws governing such devastating violations of trust and loyalty. Ultimately, Victor was stripped permanently of any position or influence within Blackthorn Pack and sentenced to permanent exile, forbidden from ever returning to territory that had once provided him such significant, ill-gotten power and respect. Grant received similarly severe consequences, given his direct role in facilitating both the original attack and the more recent attempted assault against Ivy and Wren. The remaining conspirators, having provided varying degrees of cooperation and remorse, received consequences, ranging from extended probationary restrictions to reduced exile periods, with Bree's courageous testimony and assistance ultimately earning her a path toward eventual restored standing within the pack, though not without significant continued service and demonstrated trustworthiness required over the following years. As justice was finally served, Blackthorn Pack began the longer, more gradual process of healing from 20 years of hidden betrayal, a process that Draven understood would require considerable time and patience, though the exposure of truth itself provided significant relief throughout the community, replacing decades of unknowing grief with hard-won understanding and closure. Meanwhile, within the more private sphere of family life, Draven, Elena, and Ivy continued the delicate work of building the relationships that circumstance had denied them for so many years. Elena moved gradually back into pack life, reclaiming her position beside Draven with careful patience, understanding that 20 years of absence required thoughtful reintegration rather than an immediate, overwhelming return to her previous role. Ivy, meanwhile, began learning about pack traditions, responsibilities, and history she had never been able to fully understand during her years of hidden, transient living. She spent considerable time with Grace, absorbing decades of accumulated pack wisdom, and with Callum, learning about the practical governance responsibilities that would eventually become significant, given her position as Draven's acknowledged heir. 1 month after Elena's return, Draven called together the entire pack for a formal announcement, standing before his community with Elena beside him, and Ivy positioned prominently at his other side, finally ready to formally establish his daughter's position within Blackthorn's future leadership structure. 20 years ago, Draven began, his voice carrying the weight of profound transformation the pack had experienced over recent weeks. "I believed I had lost everything that mattered most to me. Today, I stand before you with my family fully restored, and with tremendous pride, I formally name my daughter, Ivy Cross, as heir to Blackthorn Pack's leadership." The assembled crowd erupted into enthusiastic celebration, pack members who had grown to genuinely admire Ivy's thoughtful, compassionate nature throughout the past month, expressing their support with visible enthusiasm. Ivy stepped forward, her expression carrying a mixture of nervous uncertainty and quiet determination, as she addressed her new community for the first time in this significant, formal capacity. "I spent most of my life without understanding my true identity or purpose," Ivy said, her voice growing steadier as she continued speaking. "Now that I understand my heritage, my family, and my place within this remarkable community, I promise to dedicate myself fully to learning everything necessary to serve Blackthorn Pack faithfully, honoring both the difficult lessons of our recent past and the hopeful promise of our future together." Applause and warm expressions of welcome continued throughout the gathering, the pack embracing not simply the resolution of a devastating 20-year mystery, but the promising beginning of new leadership that combined Draven's steady wisdom, Elena's compassionate resilience, and Ivy's fresh, thoughtful perspective, shaped by her unusual, difficult, yet ultimately formative years of hidden upbringing. Wren remained within Blackthorn territory as well, having been formally welcomed by the entire pack as an honored member of their community, given her extraordinary 20-year sacrifice, protecting Elena and Ivy throughout their years of dangerous hiding. She settled gradually into a comfortable position within the pack's healing and herbal medicine practices, working alongside Owen and utilizing skills she had developed extensively throughout her years of transient, careful living. "You never have to leave again," Ivy told her one quiet afternoon, the two of them sitting together beneath the familiar oak tree that had witnessed so much of their stories unfolding since their arrival within Blackthorn territory. This is home now, for both of us. I never imagined I would find a true home after so many years of constant movement, Ren admitted, smiling warmly at the young woman she had raised as her own daughter throughout so many difficult, uncertain years. But watching you find your true family, your true place in this world, has been worth every difficult sacrifice along the way. As months passed and the pack continued healing from the revelations that had transformed their understanding of the past 2 decades, Draven found himself, for the first time in 20 years, experiencing genuine, sustained peace, rather than carefully managed grief, disguised as disciplined leadership. He watched Elena move confidently once again through territory she had once called home, watched Ivy grow increasingly comfortable within her new role and responsibilities, and understood, with profound gratitude, that the family he had never stopped hoping to reclaim had finally, truly, been restored to him. One evening, nearly 6 months after Elena's dramatic return, the small family gathered together within the same garden where they had first found quiet reunion, following that overwhelming day of revelation and celebration. Stars filled the clear night sky above them, the same stars that had witnessed 20 years of Draven's solitary grief, now finally witnessing the peaceful contentment of reunion fully realized. I used to come here alone every night, Draven said quietly, watching Elena and Ivy sitting together nearby, sharing quiet laughter over some small, precious moment of ordinary family life, wondering if I would ever stop grieving long enough to feel genuine happiness again. And now? Elena asked, moving closer to rest her head against his shoulder. Now, Draven said, his voice carrying quiet, profound gratitude. I understand that even the deepest grief can eventually give way to healing, provided we remain patient enough and fortunate enough to see that healing finally arrive. Ivy joined them, settling comfortably between her parents with the easy familiarity that had grown steadily throughout their months of rebuilding relationship and trust. I think, she said thoughtfully, that everything we went through, all those years of hiding, all that danger and uncertainty, somehow made this moment feel even more precious than it might have otherwise. Draven wrapped his arms around both of them, holding his family close beneath the quiet night sky. 20 years of devastating separation, finally giving way completely to the peaceful, hard-won reunion he had never stopped believing might someday become possible. Blackthorn Pack had weathered tremendous tragedy and eventual triumph, emerging from 20 years of hidden betrayal into a future built upon truth, resilience, and the profound, healing power of family, finally, completely restored. As the stars continued their quiet watch over Blackthorn territory, the story that had begun with devastating loss and unanswered questions finally reached its peaceful, well-deserved conclusion, a testament to enduring love, unwavering sacrifice, and the remarkable healing that becomes possible when long-hidden truth finally emerges into the light. In the years that followed, Blackthorn Pack grew stronger than it had been at any point during the 20 years following the original attack, its leadership structure rebuilt upon foundations of transparency and trust, rather than the careful secrecy that had allowed Victor's betrayal to remain hidden for so devastatingly long. Draven implemented new safeguards within Pack governance, ensuring that no single individual could ever again accumulate the kind of unchecked influence that had allowed such a profound betrayal to occur, and remain concealed for 2 full decades. Callum continued serving faithfully as Beta, his diligent investigation having proven essential to finally uncovering truth that had eluded the Pack for 20 years. He and Draven remained close throughout the years that followed, their bond strengthened considerably by having weathered such a significant, difficult journey together toward justice and reunion. Bree, true to Draven's promise, gradually rebuilt her standing within the Pack through years of dedicated, honorable service, eventually earning back trust and respect that her earlier complicity had cost her, though she never forgot the weight of the choice she had ultimately made to prioritize protecting innocent lives over continued loyalty to Victor's dangerous conspiracy. Ivy grew steadily into her role as heir, spending years learning alongside her father, absorbing lessons in leadership, diplomacy, and compassionate governance that would eventually prepare her to lead Blackthorn Pack into its next generation. Her unusual childhood, shaped by hiding and uncertainty, ultimately gave her unique insight and empathy that many within the Pack came to deeply respect and admire, as she matured into her responsibilities. Elena, meanwhile, found renewed purpose working alongside Ren within the pack's healing practices, using skills developed throughout years of necessary self-sufficiency to benefit the broader community that had finally welcomed her home. She and Draven rebuilt their relationship gradually, patiently, understanding that 20 years of separation could not be erased instantly, but could be steadily healed through consistent, genuine effort and enduring love that had somehow survived 2 devastating decades apart. On quiet evenings, the family often gathered within their garden, sharing stories, laughter, and the simple, precious ordinariness of life together that circumstance had denied them for so painfully long. Their story, once defined by tragedy, betrayal, and desperate hope, ultimately became a testament to resilience, the enduring power of truth, and the profound healing possible when love, patience, and courage finally overcome even the most devastating circumstances. And so, within the peaceful territory of Blackthorn, beneath skies that had once witnessed unimaginable tragedy, a family finally found the lasting peace and togetherness they had waited 20 long years to reclaim, proving that even the deepest wounds, given sufficient time, truth, and unwavering love, can eventually, beautifully heal.